Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Was Born a Girl. All credits for this video go to their respective authors. So please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. An occasional muffled voice from beyond the door. The sound of footsteps over creaking wood. More silence. Inside her head was cotton. Thick and stuffed in a small space and fit to bursting, she wasn't crying anymore. She felt as if all her tears had been spent in the hours, days before. Tick, tock. Those eyes swung back and forth and the sound of the clock was so loud. It felt like each small noise rocked the room she was in, and she drew in a slow breath and blinked dry, sticky eyes and kept them shut, small hands coming up to cover her ears. She found she hated clocks. The passage of time was her enemy, and yet she was powerless to stop it. Just like she was powerless to stop what happened to her, was unable to stop anything because it had already happened. More than ever, she wished for her hero to save her, but he didn't. He wasn't there, and how could he be? Why would he be concerned with one small quirkless girl? He didn't even know she existed, so how could he be there to save her in the first place? It didn't stop her from wishing, though. Mom, why are we here? The high-pitched voice of the girl was slightly fearful. Her mother lead her forward anyway. One hand on her extended stomach and large green eyes stared up at a tall woman with blonde hair pulled back in a bun that looked like it hurt by the pinched expression on her face. Cool gray eyes turned to look down at her, and the pinched look got worse, causing the green-haired girl to duck her head in fear. Try and be good, Izumi. Her small hand craved the mist warmth of her mother's hand when the older woman released her, and she watched, apprehensive as the woman turned her back and began walking away. Panic seized her young heart and she reached out, but a hand on her shoulder kept her from chasing after her mother. Mom, come back. Mom. She was trying to pull away with all her strength, but she was only five and quirkless and weak, and she watched her mother get into the car, speak to the man behind the wheel, and then they were driving away. Hot tears scalded her cheeks and she stilled, sobs choking her throat and soft, distressed whines escaping her. The hand on her shoulder moved to grip her hand firmly but gently, and she was pulled towards the large building, green eyes still watching the fading car and feeling her heart go with it. She turned 10 today. The orphanage workers were nice and made her a small cake and put up streamers, and she had a small party hat on. Hana-san had a camera and a tired smile on her face, and Izumi smiled and blew out the candles. It was hard, growing up in an orphanage. Potential parents had come and gone. She had even spoken with a few and gotten along with a couple. But every time the discussion turned to quirks and it came out she didn't have one, it was like a door slammed shut and they beat a hasty retreat. Little by little, the shards known as her heart fractured more each time, until she had simply given up hope. The orphanage workers were nice. The blonde women slowly became Hana-san and the cook was Fuji-san. There were others, but they came and went. The orphanage was small and really, she was the only long-term occupant of the place. What did you wish for, Izu-chan? It was one of the newer ladies, Fuda-san. She smiled faintly to herself even as she caught Hana-san flinching slightly and lowering the camera. Same thing every year, she said, but didn't elaborate on it. The small party went on and Izumi shared her cake with the few other children that were in residence with her. She knew they would be adopted soon, but she still liked looking after them. It was like she had younger siblings, and even if it hurt when they were gone, it still filled a void inside her while they were there. And she was always happy when they got homes. She wouldn't wish the empty feeling she had on anyone. Idly she wondered how her family was doing. Her little brother or sister would be turning 5. She could only hope they had a quirk unlike her, so they could live a better life than she currently led. Turning her attention back to the laughing 6-year-olds as they wrestled on the floor, she gave a small smile and went back to her notebook. She was almost done with the Blood King entry. The television in the common area was on but set so the volume was low. In the corner, a 4-year-old was passed out against a giant horse plush, and from the angle Izumi was at, she could see a long line of drool collecting on the plush's brown shoulder. Turning green eyes back to the TV, she watched as some new hero debuted against a villain that could control paper, and hummed to herself, hand busy writing while she kept one eye on the fight and another on her notebook. New hero. The voice caught her attention and she looked over and smiled at Hana-san as the woman sat beside her on a couch. The older women shifted and reached behind her to pull out an Endeavor action figure from in between the cushions and placed it aside without looking at it. Yeah, his name is Kamui Wood. His quirk is called Arbor and lets him generate wood from any part of his body. They both watched the fight on screen and Izumi added a bit of shading to the sketch of the new hero in her notebook. There's a joke I could make, but you're too young to appreciate it at the moment. Izumi shot her a confused look, but the blonde women gave her a slight smirk and waved away her curiosity. Another time, Izu-chan, probably in about 7 or 8 years, give or take. Confused and mildly disturbed by the look on the smiling woman's face, the green-eyed girl found her eyes turning to the screen again. Hey Hana-san. Apprehension clawed at the quirkless girl's heart when gray eyes turned to her, a blonde brow raised in a wordless request to continue. Do you think I could ever be a hero? There was silence, and as it stretched, a lump formed in the girl's throat before a hand gripped her shoulder. You know, a few months ago I was almost mugged. This big guy with a strength enhancement quirk had me pressed up against a wall in an alley and wanted all my money. My quirk smiled empathy, as you know, and it doesn't really help in situations like that. The blonde woman was silent before smiling at wide green eyes. But then out of nowhere this guy swings in and somehow cancels out the thug's quirk, and then proceeded to kick the oaf's butt to kingdom come and held him there with this weird scarf until the police came. His name was Eraserhead, if I heard right. I did some research and it turns out he can only erase someone's quirk. He has to use hand-to-hand combat afterwards to subdue the villain's heart pounding in her chest. Izumi can only watch as the blonde woman turned so she faced the younger girl fully. It'll be hard. You'll have to dedicate every day to build yourself up, but yeah, I think you'll make a wonderful hero. You've already got the hard part taken care of. Tears were trailing down her cheeks and the blonde huffed before pulling out a handkerchief and dabbing at her face. But what do you mean? What could the older woman possibly mean by the hard part? The blonde smiled slightly and her gray eyes were soft. You have the heart of a hero, Izumi-chan. And that's something no school anywhere can teach. Turns out, building herself up was harder than Hana-san said. The older women had gotten into contact with a few friends outside of work and put together a workout regimen for the 10-year-old. It was mostly intense stretches and the blonde helped her when she could. I used to do gymnastics and won a few medals, the older woman said, somehow able to comfortably stand on one leg with the other held up, toes pointing to the ceiling and her back arched as her hands went back to grip her calf. It looked painful. Izumi couldn't even lean over to touch her toes and she wondered if she'd ever be able to do that. Teeth flashed in a teasing grin. I'll help you with it. And you really need to stop that habit of yours, Izu-chan. Flushing to her ears, the green-haired girl ducked her head and fiddled with her fingers. Won't I need to learn how to fight, though? Green eyes glanced up and the blonde dropped her legs so she stood on both and crossed her arms. She wore a turquoise tank top and black spandex pants and matching ballet shoes. Well, yes, but you're still only 10, Izu-chan. It would do more harm than good to focus on strength training right now before you've even hit puberty. Heat rose in the girl's face again at the mention of that. She had gotten that talk on the night of her 10th birthday. Besides, while brute strength is good, you also need to be light on your feet. Villains can have all the strength in the world, but it won't do anything if they can't touch you. A gray eye winked at her and Izumi felt her lips stretching in a smile to match the blonde's. Training was hard. It made her muscles ache and sweat stuck to her and made her skin itch. The diet Hana-san assigned her made her worried she would gain weight instead of muscle, but it never happened. Instead, over the months she trained, she saw some improvements to her figure. While she was still small, her muscles began to define themselves. She was able to work for longer and gain her breath back easier, and she had the largest sense of accomplishment when she was finally able to do a complete sideways split without any strain. The forward split made the muscles in her legs and groin area burn, but she was able to do that one as well and smiled up at Hana-san, who returned it. Great, now we can start on the hard stuff. The smile on Izumi's face melted at that and a soft pout took over. I thought this was the hard stuff, she said, and was slightly scared at the glint in the blonde woman's eye. Sweetie, by the time I'm done with you, you'll look back and see this was nothing more than a warm-up. Izumi's eyes were wide and she felt a bead of sweat trail from her temple down her cheek. She was suddenly very, very worried about her future. Taking a deep breath of the autumn air, she released a slow sigh and let a smile curl her lips. It was always nice to take a jog when it was like this. The weather was pleasantly cool and had hints of the colder times to come, and she found herself relaxed. It had been 10 months since she started training with Hana-san. And 8 months since they got serious, as the older women would say. It was nice to be able to work towards something and having someone behind her saying she could do it. Entering a corner store, she went to the drinks section and picked out a bottle of vitamin water. Listening to the people around her chattering as she tried to decide on what kind of snack she should get. She did love strawberry pocky, but the chocolate-filled panda bears were also a favorite. Mommy, can we have katsudon tonight? The voice was young and excited, and she glanced over before freezing and felt like her stomach fell to her feet. It sounds good, Yu-chan. She looked different. In Izumi's memories, she was so tall and distant. She had found herself forgetting her voice, her scent, her face. And now there she stood. Dark green hair braided to the side, and she looked happy. The small boy beside her had deep brown hair that laid flat against his head, and he jittered impatiently beside the women. Stomach rolling, she felt bile creep up her throat and her breaths got fast as she staggered back in turn. Hand coming up to cover her mouth, she moved quickly towards the exit, setting the water bottle down on the way, and she accidentally bumped into a tall figure that she couldn't see clearly from the blur of tears in her eyes and sobbed out an apology before pushing past them and into the air that suddenly wasn't refreshing. It stabbed into her lungs and she broke out into a run as soon as she was out of the store. It hurt. Why did it hurt so much to see her? To see that? It hurt and it scared her, because looking at them she had felt anger, resentment and envy, and it was wrong, wasn't it, to feel like that? Looking up, she saw she had come to a beach that was filled with trash. There were mountains of it, and she found it fitting her feet had carried her to such a place. Just like her, the place had been abandoned. Shutting her eyes, she tried to push the dark thoughts away. She had it better than others. Her life could have been a lot worse, right? The orphanage workers were nice. She had Fuji-san and Hana-san, and it was enough. Staring out at the piles of trash, she found her feet carrying her forward and looked up at the piles that towered above her. If she was right, then this was the Dagaba Municipal Beach, or as the locals called it, Trash Beach. Weaving through the decrepit piles, she found the pier and walked along it until she got to the hut and sat down. Here it was so pretty, and she wondered why no one had come to clean it. With a view like this, pulling her knees up to her chest, she laid her head on them and tried to sort through her emotions and winced at the heat in her chest. She wanted to run back and do something. Ask her why. Why had she given up on her, left her at the orphanage instead of raising her? Had she really been such a burden? And that boy, that was my younger brother, wasn't it? Yu-chan. The thought made something in her clench, and she shut her eyes tightly and buried her face in her knees before pushing herself up. She couldn't stand still. She had to move, do something. Staring out at the piles of trash, she walked back down the pier and bent down to pick up an old toaster. It was rusted and a large dent bent the front, and she stood there for a second before making her way to the entrance and looked around. A large green trash can sat in an area off to the side, and she walked over and tossed the toaster into it before turning around and going back into the beach. She didn't really have a plan, but she needed to do something besides sit around and let her thoughts eat at her. She was careful each time she picked up rusty metal and old appliances. Wheeling tires towards the trash can made her back ache, and lifting it was hard, but she managed to swing it up and over the edge of the can's lip with enough momentum. The silence was only broken by her feet shuffling through the sand and the waves lapping at the shore, so she began to hum softly underneath her breath, a song she had heard Hana-san humming often enough that she was reasonably sure of the melody. Picking up what looked to be an old room heater up, she hefted it in one hand and reached down to grab a pair of old computer speakers and went back to the trash again and blinked when she realized it was full. Putting the two items she held on top of the piled items, she glanced over at the beach. It looked like she hadn't done anything at all, but her muscles were burning slightly and sweat made sand stick to her limbs. Turning towards the street, she began making her way back towards the orphanage and pushed her hands into her pockets as she thought back to the beach. It really was nice at the hut. The water was deep and blue and the sun sparkled along the water like stars. It had almost made her forget about seeing her old family. She went back. After working out with Hana-san and after school, she went back to the beach. She had grabbed some gloves and put on some old clothes. A white All Might t-shirt and some green cargo shorts. A black scrunchie kept her curls from her face, and she made sure her shoes were laced and the ends tucked into themselves so they didn't snag. Then she got to work. A borrowed MP3 player was in her pocket and white earbuds were in her ears, playing some songs Hana-san had recommended when Izumi had expressed an interest in music. It helped to have something to listen to as she worked. It kept her thoughts suppressed enough for her to ignore them. Focusing on cleaning the beach helped distract her as well, and she knew it wasn't a good way to do things, but she didn't know what else to do. It wasn't daunting, seeing all the trash in front of her. Instead, it lit a fire in her and she pushed herself all the harder. She wanted to be more than Izumi, the quirkless girl whose own family didn't even want her. She wanted to be Izumi the hero. She wanted to be like All Might and save people with a smile. She wanted to give people hope when they were afraid. She wanted to be a hero, but she knew she had a long way to go to get there. She needed to be strong. Her hands were too soft and she needed them to toughen. You need to build yourself up, Izu-chan. And it will be hard, but you can do it. I know you can. The voice of Hana-san was so strong in her ear that she thought for a moment she was there and glanced around before huffing to herself and focusing on shoving an old washing machine across the sand. Teeth gritting, she felt it give an inch and let out a slow breath and rubbed at the sweat on her forehead. This was going to be harder than she thought. She kept going back. Every day she went back to the beach after school and her workouts with Hana-san and cleaned as much of the beach as she could. Her 12th birthday came and went, and the morning of she had the pleasure of waking to bloody sheets. No one told her how much blood there would be, just that there would be some. Fuji-san was nice enough to wash her sheets as Hana-san gave her some hot chocolate and some painkillers. She didn't go to the beach that day, or the day after, but the third day she went and every day afterwards. She was determined now and she saw she was making some progress. More and more of the beach was clearing up and she had found an old rake with a bent handle and after unbending it used it to comb the beach for any objects that might be hidden in the sand. She did indeed find some things, used syringes being among them, and she was glad she never went barefoot now. She even found an old license plate from America. The red, white, and blue paint was faded and it was almost entirely coated in rust, but she thought it was interesting nonetheless. The larger objects proved troublesome, but day by day she found she was able to move more and heavier objects until one day, almost 11 months from the time she started to clear the beach, she sat back and stared at the cleared shore. White sand shone from the sunset and crystal clear waves lapped at the edges, and she let out a slow breath. Sweat dripping down her face and she used her wrist to wipe it away. The sense of accomplishment was almost heady, and she let a smile tug her lips up. Well, the voice was deep and surprised, and she jerked, glancing over to see a tall blonde man that looked like he needed to be in a hospital. His cheekbones were too sharp in his thin face, and his eyes were sunken, dark shadows cast by his brows, and all that could be seen were the electric blue pupils. He wore a baggy white shirt that looked like it might fall right off him, and equally baggy pants with boots that looked huge even on his tall frame. "Did you do this, kid?" She flushed slightly as he looked down at her and fiddled with her shirt. "Why, yeah," her words were almost a mumble, and he suddenly smiled, and she stared because it looked so familiar. "This is amazing. I haven't seen this place look this nice in a while." She looked back over the beach. "Izu-chan." The voice drew her to look over her shoulder, and the man glanced back as well. Hana-san was jogging towards them, a black tracksuit on her form and blonde hair pinned back from her face, and she looked over the beach and gray eyes swept over it. "So this is where you've been going the past several months?" she asked, and placed a hand on the green-eyed girl's shoulder, and Izumi smiled a bit unsurely. "This was fine, right? You must be proud of her," the blonde man said, and pushed his hands into his pockets, and Izumi glanced between them both. The tall skeletal man was smiling, and yet Hana-san was looking at him oddly. "Yeah, she's a good kid." Though at the changed tone, Izumi stiffened and ducked her head, wincing as a rough hand settled on her hair and ruffled it hard. "What did I say about pushing yourself? I made that training regimen for a reason. If you want to be a hero, you need to follow it." The hand shoved her head down further, and she felt so embarrassed she was sure her ears were red. "You want to be a hero?" the blonde asked, and Hana-san hummed. "Yeah, has since she was a kid. She's just stubborn enough to do it." Too. Izumi was still red, but managed to lift her head enough to aim a smile towards the man, and he laughed, head thrown back. "Well, I'm sure you'll do fine then. Being a hero's not easy from what I've seen, but with your mom being so supportive it'll be easier." Hana-san sputtered at the same time Izumi felt her own face flush. And not her mom. "I'm not that old," Hana-san yelped, flustered. The man's eyes widened, and his cheeks were red as well as he realized his mistake and waved his hand. "Sorry, it's just the way you acted, sister." "No." Hana-san was shaking her head, and Izumi ducked her head, hand pressing to her face. "She's one of the caretakers at the orphanage that I'm staying at." The words were out before she could stop them, and she swallowed before smiling up at the man. His eyes were wide and his mouth was slightly agape, and she really wished the awkward air around them would vanish. Beside her, Hana-san had gone still, and her face was twisted in an uncomfortable expression. "She's helping me work towards being a hero and is a very important person to me, though." Izumi fiddled with her fingers. "I see." The blonde smiled at her, and she returned it before her stomach let out a loud growl, and her face went past red and nearly turned purple, and she stuttered out an apology, but the man was laughing again and waving it away. "Why don't you head on back, Izumi? I'm sure Fuji-san has dinner ready. I still need to finish my jog." She looked up at the blonde women before finally nodding and hurrying down the road, pausing long enough to wave at the tall blonde man and got a small wave in return. She's really something, to be able to do this. Yes, even more impressive when you realize she did it all without a quirk. Getting into middle school brought with it new experiences. It also brought with it new people. One thing remained the same though. She was constantly looked down on because she was quirkless, and her statues spread like wildfire. By the end of her first day she had been laughed at, her bag had been appended, and her lunch had been stolen. And the teachers did nothing. They just turned their head away and pretended not to see. She honestly didn't know what to feel. She had always been blamed for how she was born, quirkless, useless. She was crying again. The tears burned down her cheeks, and she leaned against a wall and pressed her hand to her face before roughly rubbing the salty trails from her face. It was useless to cry. Crying hadn't done anything for her. It hadn't helped her at all. It certainly hadn't brought her mother back. Pulling the straps of her all-might backpack higher, she set off back to the orphanage and stopped by a store and grabbed a bottle of lychee juice. Paying for it, she left the store and bumped into someone. "I'm sorry," she yelped and glanced up only to blink in surprise as she saw a familiar skeletal man. He seemed just as surprised to see her. It's fine, Midoriya-san," he said with an easy smile, and she returned it and stepped to the side. With a small wave she turned and walked back to the orphanage. It was halfway there that she stopped, and her brows furrowed in confusion. How did he know her name? Cold shock enveloped her, and she stared at Hana-san, not comprehending her words. Shakily she collapsed onto the couch and tried to think past the buzzing in her ears. "You don't have to if you don't want to. You have a choice in this too, Izu-chan, and before we go through with anything you can sit down and talk with him. But he's a good man. We've looked into his background and I've questioned him personally." The woman pushed some pale blonde hair behind her ear and smiled softly. "But doesn't he know I'm quirkless?" the 12, almost 13-year-old questioned. It felt like her foundations were rocking and she was lost in a sea that she had no hope of navigating. "He knows. It's the first thing I told him, and he says it doesn't matter to him." There was white noise in her ears, and she released a slow breath. She fiddled with her fingers before glancing up at Hana-san's kind gray eyes. "I'd like to meet with him, if that's okay." The woman smiled. "It's more than okay, Izu-chan. They met in a room reserved for these kinds of things. Izumi herself had never been inside them because she had never gotten to this stage. Hana-san had stepped out to give them privacy, but said she'd be right outside if they needed anything. Hot tea sat on the coffee table and she didn't know what to say to the man. Sorry if this is a little sudden, the man said, one hand coming up to rub the back of his neck and blue eyes glanced around the room. It's a little weird, yeah. She took a deep breath before looking in the blonde's direction. He wore an almost ridiculously oversized yellow pinstriped suit. Hana-san had stared at him for a straight minute before huffing and gesturing him into this very room. Are you sure you're okay with this? With someone like me was unsaid, but from the man's face he understood what she was trying to say. You're a good kid. I could see that just by what you did. I have to admit the decision was made impulsively, but after talking with Hana-san I'm more sure about it. He glanced over at her and she gripped her hands tightly together. So if you're up for it, I'd be happy to offer my home to you. If you'd like, you can even keep your surname. She glanced at the papers that were also on the coffee table. All they had to do was call in Hana-san and they would sign them. Or if she decided against the whole thing, those papers would be put in a file, never to be seen again. I think I would like to be called Yagi instead. Her voice was meek and her cheeks flushed, and the man seemed surprised before he smiled. Then I guess we should call Hana-san back, and she nodded, and the thin man stood and she pushed herself to her feet as well. All too soon the papers were signed and she was gathering her belongings into 2 duffel bags, one carried by her and the other by the blonde who was now her father, and she felt nervousness fluttering in her stomach as she hugged Fuji-san and then Hana-san, the latter ruffling her hair and smiling. You'll be fine, kid, and we'll be seeing each other again. Have to check up on you every month for 6 months still. She smiled over at the tall man and he returned it. Then she was led to a car and her bags were put in the back. She was nervous and unsure, but she was also excited to see where this new chapter in her life would lead. Getting to the apartment, she found it was nice. Taking off her shoes, she found blue eyes watching her and she gave a tentative smile. Titerema, she mumbled, and the blonde man smiled in return. Akiri Nasai. It was honestly nostalgic being in Musutafu again. The city was bustling and he allowed his eyes to drift over the people rushing to destinations only they knew. Taking as deep a breath as he could, he released it and grunted. Clearing his throat, he resumed his trek to the corner store that was his target. The sales they had there were nice and the selections were impressive for such a small place. He had just walked through the automatic doors when a small figure barreled into him and he held back a wince as his side flared in pain. A muffled apology reached his ears and he watched in surprise as a small girl ducked around him. He was only able to identify dark green hair and tear-filled eyes before the girl ran from the store, and he felt indecisiveness tear at him before another figure caught his attention. She looked almost exactly like the girl who had run from the store, and holding her hand was a small boy of perhaps 6 or 7 that seemed equally as confused as he felt. He had felt awkward in a lot of situations while like this, but this one climbed the ladder and clawed at being the top so far. Clearing his throat, he moved to the side. Your daughter? He asked, and the women jolted as if he had just announced who he was at the top of his lungs. Something flashed in her eyes and she glanced down at her son before finally shaking her head. And no, and just like that she moved back into the store and he released a slow breath and tried to shake off the tension in his shoulders and focused on grabbing a basket and grabbing some things to keep him going for a few days. Despite how he tried, he couldn't seem to push the odd encounter from his mind. You need to eat better than this, Toshinori. The man's voice was slightly dull in a defeated way, as if he knew his words weren't going to change much. And though the mentioned blonde felt slightly guilty about worrying the other man, he still brought the spoon to his mouth and savored the mint chocolate chip ice cream all the same. The simple joys in life. Sorry, Naomasa, he smiled, but the other man gave him a deadpan stare even as he cracked open a container of cookie dough. You're a horrible influence. I blame you when I can't fit into these pants anymore. Even as he said those words, the detective shoveled a large amount of ice cream into his mouth. Toshinori waited patiently and then nodded sagely at the other man's curses as the coal from the treat went straight to his head. Every time. I forget about that every time. The younger man scowled and Toshinori smirked to himself and brought another spoonful to his mouth. You'll get the hang of feeding yourself soon, he said, and got a dirty look from Naomasa, and the number 1 hero wondered if it could actually curdle milk. To be on the safe side, he wrapped his hand around the container of mint protectively and raised an eyebrow at the other man. You must be in a good mood to be so snarky, Toshinori. Something good happened. Thinking back to his walk that morning and the sight of a nearly cleared beach, he smiled to himself. Something like that. He wondered who the mystery beach cleaner was. Was it one person or many? Still, it was nice seeing the old beach getting cleaned up. You had something you needed to tell me, though. The other man's black eyes turned seriously and he leaned forward. Yeah, there's been a string of robberies going on. We're seriously thinking it's the same person, but with some sort of quirk that lets him turn into liquid. Toshinori also leaned forward and listened to the explanation. All thoughts of the beach gone from his mind until later. Well, it was cleaned, the entire thing all along the coast. Not a spot of trash remained. And there at the edge was a tired-looking girl, and she was absolutely filthy. Messy dark green hair was barely held back by a hair tie that looked to be on its last legs, and she wore an old t-shirt with one of the older designs from his merchandise on it, along with some olive green cargo shorts and bright red sneakers. Green eyes turned towards him in surprise, and he was impressed when she didn't immediately shrink back from him. He was a sight after all. Did you do this, kid? And by herself? 'Cause if so, she must have had one hell of a quirk to accomplish it. When she mumbled out a soft yeah, he couldn't help the smile, and she stared at him. He wondered for a second if he was frightening her before moving past it. This is amazing. I haven't seen this place look this nice in a while. He was about to say more when a woman's voice called out, and he looked over to see a tall blonde woman with her short hair tied back in a small tail jogging up to them. She wore a simple black tracksuit, and gray eyes seemed to size him up before turning to the girl. Gray eyes swept the beach and glanced at him again, and he prepared himself for the usual reaction of disgust, or perhaps for her to pull the younger girl away from him. Instead, the woman looked away, and instead looked at the clean beach, and her eyebrows rose slightly. So this is where you've been going the past several months. The woman reached up and placed her hand on the girl's shoulder, earning a sheepish smile from the kid. It was a touching scene, really. The girl looked nervous but happy, and he found a slight smile turning up his mouth. You must be proud of her. Placing his hands in his pockets, he took in a deep breath of the fresh air. Yeah, she's a good kid. Though he glanced over in time to see the blonde woman's face had grown mildly exasperated as her hand roughly messed up the poor kid's hair, and he internally winced in sympathy. He had been the victim of that very same treatment once upon a time. What did I say about pushing yourself? I made that training regimen for a reason. If you want to be a hero, you need to follow it. With those last words, the blonde forced the girl's head further down and her hands flailed, and he spied her ears turning an alarming red color even as he thought on the words. You want to be a hero. It was hard to be one, and he should know. The old injury in his side sent a jolt of pain through him as if to reinforce the thought. Yet the woman hummed. Has since she was a kid. She's just stubborn enough to do it. To the green-haired girl was still red but glanced up at him and smiled, and he was taken back by the look in her eyes. And then he was laughing, both parts amazed and excited, because that was a look that he seldom saw in aspiring heroes. Well, I'm sure you'll do fine then. Being a hero's not easy from what I've seen. But with your mom being so supportive, it'll be easier. He was glad for the girl until the blonde's face twisted and she seemed to break into a coughing fit, and he felt his face flush when he realized he had gotten something wrong. Naomasa always said he had a bad case of foot and mouth. And not her mom. I'm not that old. Shit, well, with the amount of quirks in the world, how could anyone tell anymore? Sorry, it's just the way you acted, sister. No, the blonde was shaking her head quickly, and the kid's head was facing the ground. A hand pressed to her face, and he wanted to do the same and wished yet again for Naomasa. He was good with words and didn't fumble social interactions like Toshinori did. Being All Might only required him to reassure a few civilians and then book it as soon as he could. She's one of the caretakers at the orphanage that I'm staying at. The words were like ice water, and he stared down at the girl as she aimed a timid smile at him but wouldn't quite meet his eye, and he shut his mouth as she fiddled with her fingers. She's helping me work towards being a hero and is a very important person to me, though. Watching her fidget and then glancing up at the woman, he let out a slow breath. I see. He gave her a smile then, and she returned it before a loud gurgling growl filled the air, and he stiffened, glancing around in alarm and wondering if a villain was in the area until he saw the girl's practically purple face and the mortified look twisting her expression. She was trying to apologize, but he found himself laughing and waved it away. He was too damn paranoid if he thought a kid's stomach growling was a villain of all things. Why don't you head on back, Izumi? I'm sure Fuji-san has dinner ready. I still need to finish my jog. He felt his laughter die out and cleared his throat awkwardly at the look the other blonde sent him, and watched the green-haired girl jogging away. She turned a bit and waved, and he raised his hand to return it before dropping it back to his side and bracing himself. The look in the woman's gray eyes was piercing in a way he was only used to seeing from his detective friend. He felt like a bug under a microscope and swallowed thickly, casting around to try and just break the silence before his eyes caught the beach. She's really something. To be able to do this, he waved awkwardly at the beach and was alarming aware of how he looked. Gaunt, thin, creepy. He'd suspect himself, so of course the woman in front of him would. He'd be worried if she didn't. Yes, even more impressive when you realize she did it all without a quirk. Those words stalled his brain, and he tried to process them, looking out at the beach and its clean sand and clear water. Was all he could get out, without her quirk. Did she just not have one useful for something like this? Or was she like he used to be? She's quirkless, if you're wondering. He looked over in surprise and found the blonde was staring at the beach and had turned so her side was facing him, arms crossed in a way that suddenly reminded him almost painfully of his mentor. I see, this is more than amazing. Then she nodded before looking at him, and he found a lump in his throat and had trouble taking a full breath. It was like the woman was looking right through him and suddenly knew all his secrets. He felt sweat beading on his forehead. No need to be so nervous. I only bite when I have to. He let out the breath he had been holding, and she smirked at him in a way that made him worried all over again. My quirk is mild empathy, so I know you weren't talking to little Izu-chan for any nefarious reason. But I'd still like to ask you to not discourage her from her goals if you happen to come across her again." He tried to think of a response to the woman's words and instead turned his thoughts to the girl. She had no quirk and yet cleared this beach by herself. The baggy clothes she wore hung on her, but he was reasonably sure she was strong. But his side twinged in pain and he worried. While he wanted to say she could become a hero, he saw how small she was and had a mental flash of her, years later, against someone with a quirk that was too powerful. Are you sure you should be encouraging her to do something so dangerous? If she became a police officer or a detective, even a doctor, she could still save lives and help people. Why not that? Why not something safer, is what he wanted to ask. Because the thought of that small girl with the 2 bright green eyes and tentative but real smile off facing danger without anything to back her up made the place where his stomach used to be twist. I sat down and talked with her about that. Once gray eyes were looking up at the sky before returning to the coastline. She said that even though those professions are good ones, she wanted to be a hero. A smile pulled up the woman's lips and the soft look was one he had seen on a lot of people's faces. Her words were, "I want to be a hero that gives people hope, so that they know that even if things are scary that it'll be alright because I am there. I want to protect people so they don't have to live in fear ever again." His heart was beating fast and he tried to think past the roaring in his ears. In his veins one for all flowed like lightning, and he swallowed thickly and tried to clear his head and push away the chills that had crept up his spine. "You obviously care a lot about her. Why haven't you thought of taking her in?" Because it was blatantly obvious how much the woman cared about the girl. The blonde had sighed and her shoulders slumped. "I had thought of it, many times in fact. But something always held me back. Thoughts like I don't have the means or I wouldn't be there enough for her. But after a while I realized that those weren't the things holding me back as much as one." She looked at him and smiled in a way that was sad. "The real reason was because I was scared. The responsibility of a child isn't something to be taken lightly, and I crawfished away from it until I realized Izumi doesn't need someone who doesn't want to dedicate 120% of themselves to her." She lifted her hand then and clenched it tightly. "I can help train her, guide her and teach her, but when it comes down to it, I'm not the right person to take her in. I care about her a lot and care enough to let her go somewhere that is better for her than what I ever could be." He didn't know what to say and he thought about his mentor, about how she loved her son so much she gave him up for a better life, and felt his jaw clench slightly. "You really love her, don't you?" A soft laugh escaped the woman and she rubbed the back of her neck and looked at him from the corner of her eyes. "Yeah, there's no denying that. It's silly if you think of my profession, but it's hard not to love each kid that comes into my care. Izumi though, she's special. She'll go on to be great someday. And I can't wait to sit back and watch her shine, knowing I had at least a small hand and that will be worth everything." He thought back to the girl and had to agree. If she was even half as kind as he saw from just being around her barely 5 minutes, he knew she could be something of legend. If she had the opportunity and the help. What is the adoption process? For a second he wondered if someone else had joined their conversation until he realized the words had come from him. Naomasa was going to be pissed. "Toshinori, no." "Toshinori, yes," the black-haired man groaned, hands threading through his hair and face meeting the table, and the loud smack echoed in the apartment even as the blonde reached out and tugged some more legal papers towards him and started filling those out too. "Kids are not like a cat or a dog, Toshinori. You can't just decide to adopt one out of the blue." Really, the other man was being overdramatic, really overdramatic. Hana-san had practically given him a laundry list of things he'd have to do and the hoops he would have to go through to even get them to consider him for an adoption. Though apparently the process was going faster because of the woman's quirk. She was able to tell with physical contact a person's emotions relatively well, and it was almost like Naomasa's quirk in that she used it during the interview to tell if his intentions were pure. He had job interviews as a team that were less nerve-wracking. Then in the days to come she had come over to his apartment and inspected it. It was a 2-bedroom only because he hadn't been able to find a smaller one, and it was nice. Nothing fancy but well kept all the same, with a kitchen and living area and a full bathroom. She had said it was fine and then questioned him on his employment status, if he had a job and how much it paid, and he panicked a bit over that before blurting he worked at a hero agency as a secretary. The woman had only given him a look and he knew he had been caught in that little lie. "If you can't talk about it, then say so. You're not the first person who has been looking to adopt and yet can't share their employment details. As long as it's legal and you are earning enough to support Izumi and yourself while making sure she is given all she needs, then it's fine." It was a relief to not have to crab walk around what he really did. One thing he did realize he would need to do is stock up on groceries. He was used to just eating when he noticed he was tired and yet had slept, so his pantry was sparse. Hana-san had cast him another disapproving stare, and he felt like a child when she suddenly began to lecture him on proper care of a minor and then on proper care for himself, and before he knew it she had written up 2 meal plans. One for the girl he was looking to adopt and another for himself, and he was just a little bit overwhelmed. Everything else he was able to do easily, like cleaning out the other bedroom that had been his storage room and setting up another bed. He kept everything neutral so hopefully the girl would add her own touches and make it her own. There were other things, background checks and the like that luckily he had convinced Naomasa to do, which is how the man found out why he needed to conduct a background check on the #1 hero. And then the black-eyed man had been complaining the entire time afterwards. She's a good kid, Naomasa, and she reminded him so painfully of himself that it made his head spin. The younger man picked his head up so his chin rested on the table with his arms slumped, hands on the edge as he groaned. "You're not gonna reconsider, are you?" "Who am I kidding? Of course not." With those words, Naomasa pushed himself up and ran a hand through his hair. "Good kid or not, you're taking on a big responsibility. It's not easy taking care of someone else, let alone being a parent. You barely take care of yourself as it is signing his name on another line." He flushed slightly. Did he really have to point that out? He knew how he looked and didn't need it rubbed in. It's not as easy as feeding her and giving her a roof over her head. You have to be there for her emotionally, be invested in her future and help her when she needs it, if even for the little things, like boys. His thoughts screeched to a halt as the word boys crossed the other man's lips, and he was shocked at a heat building in his sternum when he thought of the green-eyed girl with some faceless kid. Damn, you've already got the "I'll kill anyone who touches my kid" look. I've only seen it on my old man's face when my sister brought home a boyfriend. It's a little scary to see on you. Toshinori shaking the feeling away. The blonde glanced up and saw the other man laughing at him and let out a soft huff. "Shut it. I haven't even adopted her yet and you have me getting gray hairs over nothing." He had to stop himself from signing All Might instead of Yagi Toshinori on the next line and rubbed at his eyes. "Well, at least on you no one will be able to tell. Perks of being a blonde, I guess," said Blonde. Really wanted to make his opinion on that known but kept his mouth shut. If he was going to have a kid in the house soon, he would need to tame his more mature language. Then again, there was always English. "Have you even thought about the fact you're All Might? How are you going to explain that?" With a sigh, Toshinori placed his pen down and leaned his elbows on the table, pressing his clasped hands to his chin. "I'll tell her eventually, but I can only use one for 4 hours a day, and it can be explained away as me going to work and she still has school. If I do everything right, she won't know until I feel it's the right time." Naomasa stared at him a long moment before exaggeratedly looking to the side, and blue eyes followed to stare at his hero costume thrown haphazardly over the back of the couch. His belt was on the coffee table and one red boot was underneath it. Where the other one had gotten to was anyone's guess. He felt a cough climbing up his throat as he whipped back to give the smug man a look. "I'm obviously not going to leave my stuff around when she's here." The look did not leave the detective's face, and with a grimace Toshinori clicked the pen out and got back to the paperwork. Raising a kid couldn't be that hard, right? Really, the things on Hana-san's list were beginning to get weird. Why would a girl need 20 bars of chocolate? Unless Izumi-san just liked chocolate. But who was he to judge when he had a running addiction to mint ice cream? He was just entering the corner store when a small form bumped into him, and a sense of déjà vu came over him when he recognized dark green hair and a face full of freckles. She had yelped an apology before green eyes locked with his, and he gave an easy smile. "Ah, it's fine, Midoriya-san." He couldn't really call her Izumi-san right then, and Midoriya was the name she had been given up under. The girl smiled at him and stepped to the side and waved at him before hurrying off towards the direction of the orphanage, and he smiled before entering the store and grabbing a basket and heading to the candy aisle. There were many different brands of chocolate, but there was a small note on the list that told him Izumi preferred the ones that had fruit flavors, the main choices being lemon, raspberry, and orange, and he picked up the large bars and eyed them with a raised brow before dumping them into his basket before a flash of light green caught his eye, and he picked up the box of chocolate bars that had mint cream in the center. Shrugging, he tossed it in as well before going to grab his usual vitamin water and checking out. He got a look from all the chocolate bars from the woman and shrugged helplessly, and she smiled. "Daughter or wife?" she asked, and he was caught flat-footed and was unsure how to answer. A daughter. Actually, she would legally be his daughter, right? It wasn't presumptuous to say something like that. You might want to grab some Tylenol as well." Then she nodded to the small bottles that were beside the register, and he was even more confused, and it showed as the woman laughed. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it eventually. It's really sweet of you," though he just nodded, not understanding a lick of what this woman was saying, and yet still pulled a small bottle of Tylenol from the rack, and she smiled and giggled and scanned it. He beat a hasty retreat from the store, more than a little freaked out as he tried to figure out why Izumi would need so much chocolate and painkillers. He didn't think he'd ever get used to it, whatever it was. When Hana-san called and told him Izumi was open to the ideal of him adopting her, he felt his heart pound and his palms grew sweaty. Before, he was just talking about it, had even bought things and set a few things up for her. His fridge had groceries in it instead of just bottles of water and his medication. The pantry had dry goods and some healthy snacks instead of the usual single box of Pop-Tarts. Now it was happening, and he didn't know how to handle it and went through his apartment and made sure any clue as to who he was hidden as far back in his closet as possible and dressed in his yellow suit. Feeling a bit silly, but he still pulled on his tie and fought his hair with a comb even if it just sprang back up looking worse. Finally, just leaving it, he left his apartment and took the car Naomasa had been nice enough to lend him and drove to the orphanage and was led by a nice enough older woman into a room. She left and returned with a pot of tea and a small stack of papers and left them on the coffee table, and he managed to get out a soft thanks before she just smiled and left, and he sat there stewing in his own thoughts. He was nervous, more so than before his debut. Saving people was one thing, but he had never really thought about a family. Had always shied away from the thought because of what he has seen happen to his own mentor, and even after All for One was taken care of, had never thought on it because, honestly, who would want someone who was half dead anyway? The door opened and he glanced up to see Izumi shuffle in, and Hana-san stood beside her and gave him a smile. "I'll be right outside if you need anything. Just come get me when you've agreed on something." With that, she gave a bow and closed the door, and Izumi came over and sat on the couch, and they both sat in silence, and if Toshinori had a stomach he was sure it would be filled with butterflies. Sorry if this is a little sudden." His hand came up to try and rub the tension from his neck, but found it was a lost cause and cast his eyes around the room to try and figure out what else to say. "It's a little weird, yeah." Oh great, now she thought he was weird. Great first impression on the kid. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" The hesitance in her voice drew his eyes, and he found his eyes fixed on the girl. She was hunched in on herself, and her hands were gripping her knees tightly, and he felt his world tilt as he remembered himself being in the same position once, unsure and yet hopeful. His dreams had been crushed that day. He hadn't the heart or the want to do the same to her. "You're a good kid. I could see that just by what you did. I have to admit the decision was made impulsively, but after talking with Hana-san I'm more sure about it." And he was. This girl, it would be hard. He was sure somehow he was going to hurt her, but he couldn't just turn his back on her. She needed help, and what kind of hero would he be if he turned his back on her? "So if you're up for it, I'd be happy to offer my home to you. If you'd like, you can even keep your surname." He watched as she seemed lost in her own thoughts. He had asked about her situation, but Hana-san had said the girl would tell him when she was ready. He wondered just what the girl had gone through to get to here. I would like to be called Yagi." Instead, her words were hesitant, and her cheeks had gone red, and Toshinori found himself at a loss for words, but there was a warmth spreading in his chest, and he found himself smiling. "Then I guess we should call Hana-san back," and he said and stood. He found suddenly he wasn't nervous, or he was but wasn't as much as before. And as Hana-san was let in and smiled in a knowing way, he found himself returning it as they signed the final pieces of paperwork, and he found himself waiting on Izumi as she said her goodbyes. He watched Hana-san's face carefully and felt his smile dim when the other woman's face saddened before she pasted on a bright smile and ruffled green hair. "You'll be fine, kid, and we'll be seeing each other again. I have to check up on you every month for 6 months." Still, Hana-san aimed a smile at him, and he returned it, trying to put in reassurances in every bit of it, and she huffed and nodded at him. He walked with Izumi to the car and put her bags into the back, getting in and making sure she had buckled up before he started the car, and took a deep breath before smiling. This was a little scary, he had to admit, but he found that the fear was overwhelmed with a sense of rightness, and he wondered if Nana-sensei would approve. Getting to the apartment, he tried to subtly help the girl relax. She was tense and jittery, but the smile on her face was blinding, and he held the door open for her and kicked off his shoes, watching her look around the entryway in curiosity, and he had a mental image of a cat in a new place. When Green Eyes turned to him, she gave another smaller, more sheepish smile. Tadema, he wondered how long she had been waiting to say that, and decided that it had been long enough. Akari Nasai, and he meant every word of it, too. Dinner was tense, not in a bad way, but more along the fact that they had no clue what to say to one another. What was she supposed to say? She had already thanked him for allowing her to live with him, had stilted conversation with him as he showed her around the apartment she now called home. But when dinner rolled around, there was a stifling silence that hung over their shoulders, and she nibbled at her rice. What am I supposed to call you?" The words eked out of her before she could swallow them down, and the man opposite her perked up before slumping, tilting his head and rubbing the back of his neck. Whatever you're comfortable with, I guess. If you're only comfortable for now calling me just Toshinori, then go for it. Seeing as we both have the name Yagi, it would be confusing, I think." He coughed into a fist, and she swallowed and took a drink of her tea. Thinking on it, just calling him father or dad so soon was, while technically he was to say it, was a bit embarrassing for her. She was honestly relieved to be given a different form of address for him. "Toshinori-san then?" she asked, and held her chopsticks tightly and watched from beneath the fringe of her hair as the blonde smiled at her. "If that's what you want to call me, then it's fine. We'll figure this out as we go along." She nodded and picked her head up to give him a smile of her own. "You can call me Izumi if you'd like," though she had no clue what else he could call her besides Izu-chan. "Izumi-san then. At least until we get to know each other better." She nodded, and after that it was more awkward silence as they finished their meal, and she got up, gathering the dishes and placing them in the sink. You don't have to wash them. She nearly jumped at the fact the older man had followed her but gave him a sheepish smile while he ducked his head. I'm used to doing it. Back at the orphanage I liked to help the other caretakers with the kids. She turned on the water and was curious when the blonde man stepped up beside her. In that case, how about you wash and I dry? He held up a cloth and his eyes closed in a smile, and she returned it. In the silence afterward was a little more comfortable, and there was a question she couldn't help but ask. Why did you adopt me, Toshinori-san? There are a lot more kids out there who need homes, and not that I'm not thankful. I don't think I can ever thank you enough. But she bit her lip and held the bowl in her hands tightly. But why you? His voice was contemplative, and she gave a shaky nod, and he took the bowl from her hands and gave it a rinse underneath the water before setting it still dripping on the rack and pulled the plug. Water went down the drain, and he gestured for her to follow him, and she did, heart in her throat even as they settled on his old but comfortable couch. When I was young, my parents passed away in car accident, and I ended up in an orphanage as well. My quirk. Well, I was an extremely late bloomer, so no one wanted me because they thought I was quirkless. Her eyes were wide and his smile was small even as he shrugged and ran a hand through his sunflower yellow hair. So I guess I can understand what you are going through. I know there's no way to make you feel better about what happened to you, and eventually I would like to hear the entire story, if only to understand you better. Until then, I want you to know that I'm here for you. When I signed those papers, I took up the responsibility to dedicate myself to your development, and I don't regret it a bit. His face, despite being thin with sunken and shadowed eyes, was gentle. With a soft sniff, tears fell from her eyes and the man panicked. Blue eyes wide, and he suddenly coughed, and there was blood, and then she was panicking because he was coughing blood, and her head felt light. Phone. She needed a phone. Needed to call an ambulance and get help because blood, and Toshinori-san was coughing it. Izumi-san. It's fine. She looked at him like he was nuts and blanched at the blood trailing down his chin that he was using a hand towel to wipe away. I had hoped to tell about this without frightening you, he said, and she hesitated but sat down when he patted the couch. 3 years ago, I got into a pretty bad fight that injured me to the point where I had to get a lot of surgery, and my stomach was removed along with most of my left lung. Even after healing, I tend to cough up blood when I'm stressed or surprised and have to take medication. But other than that, I'm fine. She tried to process the fact that the man in front of her coughed blood regularly and didn't have a stomach. Was that why his serving of food was so small? Because he physically couldn't ingest as much. You said a fight, so you used to be a hero then? She asked, and he gave a soft hum and nodded as he folded the towel and sat it on his knee. Yeah, it was rough, but I managed to win, though I obviously didn't get away unscathed. He gestured to himself with a wry smile before it dropped. Why were you crying though? I didn't say something that upset you, did I? The concern in his eyes was something she wasn't used to seeing from anyone other than Hana-san or Fuji-san, and she forced the lump in her throat down and instead gave a strangled squeak. I cry a lot. Her cheeks were flushed and she tried to not look at him. At small things, at big things, happy, sad. I'm just a crier, I guess. It's what Hana-san said. At least she held in a flinch when a hand was suddenly on her hair and the curls fell around her face when it was ruffled. She glanced up in time to see the man's face had twisted to look slightly surprised at his own actions before he pulled his hand back and rubbed his neck. Oh, sorry, but you don't have to apologize for how you are. It just shows that you care a lot. He smiled and she returned it. She found herself doing that a lot, smiling. It wasn't like she hadn't done it before, but now she found it hard not to because she felt light, like something in her chest had loosened its hold. It wasn't completely gone, but it was less oppressive. The clock in the living room chimed and they both glanced over in surprise. Though, it's already 9. Toshinori stood and she shot a look at the towel he had grabbed before following his actions. You have school in the morning, right, Izumi-san? He asked, and she let out a small affirmative noise and glanced towards the kitchen. You can use the restroom first. I'll put the dishes up. After a second, she let out a slow breath and nodded again before going to her room and taking a minute to look around it. Most of her stuff was still in her bags besides a few change of clothes, and she gathered her all-night pajamas and her toiletries before leaving the room and shutting the door and locking it behind her. The bathroom was nice and slightly bigger than the one she was used to, with a full shower and bathtub, and she wondered if it would be all right to use it during the weekend. She hadn't had a bath in a long while because the orphanage didn't have one. Placing her items down, she did her business and changed. She usually had a shower in the early mornings. Glancing in the mirror, she took in her appearance. Her pajama pants were the same blue of her hero's costume, with bright red All Might S outlined in white covering them with yellow V's underneath the words. Her shirt was the same bright yellow as the V's and had all M emblazoned on the front. Picking up her dirty clothes, she paused and thought back. Did Toshinori-san tell her where the laundry was supposed to go? There wasn't any hamper in the bathroom. Hesitant, she carried her clothes in her arms and glanced into the kitchen and saw him putting their chopsticks away. Toshinori-san. He let out a faint hum as acknowledgement. Where am I supposed to put laundry? Her eyes followed him as he pushed the drawer back. Oh, I forgot about that. It's just down the he cut off, and she looked up at him to see him staring down at her with wide eyes, and she followed his eyes to glance down at herself in confusion. A soft cough made her glance up, but he was already moving away and waving her to follow. Anyway, it's here. He showed her a door she had at first thought was a supply closet, but opened up into a small room with a washer and dryer inside and a small hamper in the corner. I usually do laundry every Sunday. She put her clothes in the mostly empty hamper that held a familiar towel and closed it before hurrying out of the room. For some reason, the air around them was awkward again, and she gnawed on her lower lip as he scratched at his head. Well, I guess good night. I am pretty bad at this, aren't I? He let out a soft huff of a laugh, and she ducked her head. You're trying. She let out a soft breath and smiled up at him, trying to show with that one action just how grateful she was to him. And that's enough. Cheeks flushing, she avoided looking at him and waved, hand reaching up to tug at some of her hair. Good night, Toshinori-san, and with that she ducked into her room. Good night, Izumi-san. She caught his smile and returned it before shutting the door, and she let out her breath in a soft whoosh and leaned her forehead against it, mind running a mile a minute and cheeks warm. She listened as there was movement outside going towards the kitchen, and after a while soft footsteps back, and she heard the bathroom door open and close before the sound of the shower going made her move away from the door. At least she knew taking a shower in the morning wouldn't be a problem if he took his showers at night. The lights were already off in her room, so she went to her bed and picked up her phone. It had been a gift from Hana-san in celebration of her adoption, and the woman had paid for a full year of coverage already. She had even gotten Izumi a cute little all-might charm and an all-might case for it. Though the woman's smile when she gave the younger girl those items was odd, almost like she knew a joke but didn't want to bother telling the green-eyed girl. Opening the internet, she entered in a search and rolled onto her stomach to read through the different articles, one hand coming up to cup her chin and her finger tapping softly against her lip as she thought, and she used one finger to scroll through the page. They were actually a lot more simple than she thought they would be. And after 30 minutes and hearing the other resident exit the bathroom and head to his room, she shut her phone off and pulled the covers over herself. The bed was soft and the room was dark and foreign, but she found herself drifting off. It was odd how a complete stranger made her feel oddly safe. A soft alarm made her eyes pop open and she blinked, disorientated and more than a little confused, until she remembered. She had been adopted. Her little quirkless Izumi had been adopted, and she was currently in her bed, in her room. She was Yagi Izumi now, not Midoriya Izumi, and the thought hadn't cemented in her head until just then. When it did, she found a grin stretching her face, and she rolled over to smother it into her pillow, a giddy giggle escaping her, and she leaned up to rub tears from her eyes before pushing herself up and checking the time. It was currently 6 a.m. and she hummed and prepared to get ready when she paused. She wasn't at the orphanage anymore. She didn't need to get up early to help with breakfast or help wake the other kids up. She could technically sleep for another hour if she wanted to. She pushed herself up and got her uniform anyway. Thoughts from last night coming back, and she smiled to herself as she entered the bathroom and started the shower. She didn't have to, but thinking back on the articles she read, it would just be easier to keep to her usual wake-up time. Drying off and putting on her uniform after drying her hair, she left off her jacket and tie and walked from the bathroom with both items over her arm and silently padded into the living area and glanced around. Everything was dark and still, and she placed the rest of her uniform on the back of the couch before heading into the kitchen and looking around. She found a black apron that was way too big for her, but she just folded it in half and tied it around her anyway before searching the kitchen and finding the items she needed, including a set of bento boxes that hadn't even been taken out of their packaging yet. Cooking breakfast was something that was normal for her, and she hummed faintly to herself as she moved around. It took some getting used to the new layout of the kitchen, and she glanced at the clock and saw it was edging towards 7:30 a.m. Almost as if sensing she was almost done, she heard a door open and felt her heart jump before trying to calm herself. Izumi-san. The voice was sleepy, and she looked over and bit her lip. If she thought his hair had been wild before, seeing it now was something else entirely. It stuck almost completely up like a character from the old retro cartoon called Dragon Ball. I made breakfast. She held up the frying pan tilted enough for him to see the frying eggs. The man still looked surprised and more than a little blurry-eyed, but he gave her a smile. You didn't have to, but thank you, Izumi-san. She placed the bowls with rice and miso down and served up the fried eggs and carried the tea to the table before taking a seat herself. They both said a quick thanks for the food before digging in. This is good, he said, and she smiled brightly. Thank you. Fuji-san taught me. He set his tea down before something seemed to catch his eye, and she followed his gaze to several small containers that lined the countertop, and she felt her cheeks flush. I read up on people who don't have stomachs and learned they need to eat a lot, but in small meals over the course of the day, so I made you lunches to take with you to work. It's just small things like some stir-fried potatoes or rice and chicken. I read also that you need foods with high calories and tried to take that into account, but I've never really thought about calorie intake before, so might not have made it right. A hand messing her hair stopped her and her mouth snapped shut with a click. Before long the hand pulled back and she looked past her tangled bangs to see Toshinori smiling. Thank you, Izumi-san. I feel like you're taking care of me more than I'm taking care of you, though she immediately shook her head. No, you've done a lot for me, Toshinori-san. I just want to help as much as possible. He was quiet before sighing and relaxing back in his seat. I think I still have a lot to learn about this whole parent thing, but I do know you don't have to feel obligated to do things for me. It's not that I don't appreciate them, Izumi-san. And if you want to continue to make breakfast and lunch, that's fine. But don't feel you have to do things to make yourself useful. You're still a kid and should get the chance to enjoy being your age. Believe me, being an adult isn't all it's cracked up to be. He gave her a bright smile before the moment was ruined when he coughed and blood ran down his chin. She felt her entire body stiffen and she squeaked, heart jumping, but he swiftly brought a dishcloth to wipe at his face. It's almost 8. Do you know the way to your school from here, or would you like me to walk you? He asked, and she glanced at the clock and found it was 7:50 a.m. Thinking about where they were, she brought out her phone and typed in the address and found if she hurried she would make it in 20 minutes. It's actually shorter from here than the orphanage. But I'll be late for registration if I don't go now. Slightly frazzled, she hurried to bundle up their lunches. It's turning into a small tower, but she managed the knot and handed the tower lunch to the thin man before throwing her uniform jacket on and tying the tie around her neck quickly. Her spare hand threaded through her hair quickly and she trotted over to the entranceway and pulled on her shoes. Izumi-san, wait. She turned and Toshinori held out a key on a small silver keychain. Here, it's a key to the apartment in case I'm not back by 3. My work hours are pretty hectic. She felt a swell of emotion as she took the keychain and stared at it before placing it in her bag. Thank you, Toshinori-san. Ikemasu. She pulled open the door but paused when she heard a soft it-rashi and blinked hard before shutting the door and hurrying to the elevator, heart pounding and hands holding her bag tightly. A soft smile pulled her lips up and she giggled to herself and tried to get herself together when the elevator stopped and opened to allow a small boy to bounce in. He wore a familiar uniform she had worn once upon a time, and she smiled faintly at the memories, even if most of them were painful. When the elevator reached the end, she made sure the boy got off first and stepped out afterwards before walking towards her school and found her steps light. Nothing could upset her today. She was adopted. Toshinori was nice and everything was perfect. Sometimes she hated herself. She thought this as she went about gathering up her dirty notebooks and wiped away a bit of dirt on her forehead with a soft sigh. One would think the girls of her school wouldn't be so physical in their attacks, but in some ways they were worse than the boys. She was only glad the blonde with the explosive quirk didn't pay much attention to her at all. He would almost be cute if he wasn't such a jerk. Shaking the absurd thought from her head, she picked up her hero analysis notebook and stared at the footprint on the cover before just stuffing it into her bag. Her lunch was ruined, strewn across the ground, and she felt tears sting her eyes before she pushed them back. It was fine. It wasn't like she wasn't used to it, and honestly she wondered why she thought today would be different. It didn't matter that she had been adopted. She was still quirkless, and that would never change in their eyes. But that was okay. She now had 2 people that believed in her. Well, Toshinori-sen hadn't said so, but she'd like to think he did. She hoped he had at least hadn't said anything against it. It had to count for something, right? She was walking home when young voices caught her attention, and she glanced over to see some elementary school kids playing in the park, and the uniform made her nostalgic, and she found a slight smile curling her lips, and she let out a soft breath before the full extent of what she was seeing caught her attention. 2 of the older-looking boys were trying to make themselves look taller so that they could tower over the younger boy, and when one of the other kids shoved him, she found her legs moving before she could think. Panicking slightly, she took in a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. Just like Hana-san, just act like Hana-san. Hey, what do you think you brats are doing? Too much like Hana-san. But it seemed to work because the 2 boys went rigid and glanced at her before hightailing it, and she let out a gusty sigh and glanced at the boy who seemed to have deflated. Thanks, he mumbled, and she smiled when he turned to look at her. And then she felt her world tilting as she looked into familiar green eyes with freckles all over his face, and suddenly she couldn't breathe and there was a dull roaring in her ears. Hey, are you okay? His voice snapped her out of it, and she released a slow breath that trailed into a nervous giggle. I am fine, just never mind. She shook her head before bowing. I'm Miyagi Izumi. The boy smiled brightly, and it was like looking in a mirror. Midoriya Yuyudai, though my friends call me Yu. She felt a brittle smile take over her face before glancing in the direction the boys had run. Why were they messing with you? Please don't let him be quirkless. She wouldn't wish this on anyone. Because they think my quirk's weak. The jerks. The pout on his face was frankly adorable, and she took a deep breath as relief flowed through her and crouched down. Well, that's dumb. All quirks can be useful. It's just how you use them. The bright smile on his face made deja vu echo through her in this meeting. It was painful. And there was a frightening part of her that was envious of the boy in front of her. But he didn't deserve that. He didn't abandon her. For that the blame lay squarely on her birth parent's shoulders. So what's your quirk? She asked, and his shoulders straightened as he grinned. I can control air. He wiggled his fingers, and she watched some leaves dance about from the boy's quirk and smiled softly. You know, with that you can do a lot of things, though that's depending on what you really move, the air currents themselves or the oxygen in the air. If it's the former, eventually you might be strong enough to lift things or create tornadoes. If it's oxygen manipulation instead of air currents, then you could easily pull oxygen away from fires to suffocate them and eventually extinguish them, which would go a long way in rescue efforts. She felt a tug on her sleeve. Ni-chan, you're mumbling. White noise. All she heard was white noise, and she wondered in panic if he knew. Ni-chan, she asked, and he blushed to his ears. Well, you know a lot, and you helped me. He kicked at the ground, and she let out a slow breath and laughed a tad nervously. She wanted Toshinori-san. She couldn't deal with this. Ah, all right then, but not really. It wasn't all right, was it? She had no clue what to feel, and too many emotions were building that she pushed herself up. Well, I need to head home. Try and stay safe, all right, Yudai-kun. She settled on his given name. Calling him Midoriya-san was too painful right then, but his name wasn't much better. She watched him wave and bounce out of the park and let out a shaky breath. One who is a great hero. Her parents had named her younger brother that, and no doubt hope he would be better than their failure of a daughter. Turning, she made her way back to the apartment she now lived at. Not up to doing her daily workout. She could miss a day, right? Yes, she could. She didn't feel up to much of anything. She was going slower than she usually walked, and when she got into the elevator she felt relief that no one else got in. That relief swiftly fled when the doors opened and she glanced up, green eyes wide at what she saw, and she quickly moved, pressing herself to the side of the elevator, and her hand reached out, smashing the close button quickly as sweat trailed from her forehead, and after a few moments the doors shut and she pressed the button for the floor beneath hers. Her heart was beating so hard in her chest it felt like it was about to leap from her chest, and her limbs were shaking badly. Her luck wasn't that bad, right? Surely she had seen wrong. But she hadn't. No matter how many years passed, she would recognize that person. She looked almost exactly like her after all. Hands coming up to cover her face, she bit back a scream of pure frustration. It felt like some higher power out there was trying to make her suffer, and she didn't know what she had done wrong. The doors opened and she peeked out before slumping and stepping off the elevator and towards the door that led to the stairs. Her feet felt like lead as she trudged up the concrete steps, and when she got to her floor she cautiously looked around before hastily making her way to her door and checked the door and found it unlocked. Opening it, she saw a familiar pair of shoes and shut the door behind her in relief. Tadema, she called softly, and from further in the house she heard a soft Akari Nasa and felt tears suddenly pour from her eyes and leaned against the front door, sliding down until she sat and buried her face in her knees and just cried. Izumi-san. The concern only made the tears worse, and she let out a soft sob. Long arms wrapped around her and she leaned into the support, face buried into a white baggy t-shirt and no doubt soaking it in her tears, but she just couldn't stop them. She thought she was over this, but seeing her brother, clueless and not knowing who she was, and then finding out she lived just a few doors down, could she not just leave her past behind? Reaching out, she gripped the white cotton and choked out a half apology before another sob destroyed her words, and she was left gasping for breath and unable to think past the migraine that was building in her temples. Her mother, she lived just 2 doors down. Her younger brother lived 2 doors down. Why did she finally get a life she believed was as far away from her past as possible, only to end up right next to it instead? Eventually her tears subsided and embarrassment took over. Toshinori-san's shirt was soaked through, but instead of going to change he led her to the couch and went to the kitchen, coming back with 2 mugs of hot chocolate and sitting beside her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough she could feel his body heat. It was comforting, and he didn't ask or pry why she had been crying. He only offered her silent comfort, and she thinks it's that which finally makes her talk. He deserved to know after all, after she had practically drowned him in her tears. So she talks about how her mother's face changed when she found out Izumi had no quirk, how her mother went from loving to distant, she wasn't cruel, just withdrawn emotionally, of how her father came back and would never look at her. And eventually her mother told her she was pregnant, and how excited Izumi had been at the thought of a sibling. She had never realized it was her replacement, until she was left watching her mother walk away from her. The orphanage had been nice to her. She always got what she needed, and Hana-san and Fuji-san were like the older sisters she never had. But it wasn't the same. She watched children come in and then leave within weeks to new families, would be hopeful every time a couple would show interest in her before their expressions changed, just like hers when they learned she was quirkless. She had learned at a young age that quirkless might as well have meant not good enough, but she still tried until somewhere along the way she was no longer excited but resigned every time someone would show interest in her, because she knew that it wouldn't last. And she would smile so Hana-san and Fuji-san wouldn't see how much it hurt. She smiled so people around her wouldn't see how much it broke her to see people turn away from her just because she happened to be born different than others. Eventually her words dried up like her tears, and she sat with lukewarm choco as the blonde man sat quietly beside her, eyes shadowed more than normal, and his own beverage abandoned on the coffee table. Eventually he let out a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep before he shifted to look at her, and she was surprised yet thankful when there was no pity in his gaze. Instead, sympathy and understanding was there, and she remembered that like her he had thought he had been quirkless at one point, had been in her shoes. "I'm sorry, Izumi-san, that you had to go through something like that. It's wrong and no one should have to go through that. Your mother, what she did was wrong." And he cut himself off and his hands loosened from the fists he had clenched them into before he reached out and pulled her into his side, and she stiffened before relaxing in the hold. It was warm and made something in her chest loosen. "You're more than good enough, Izumi. Don't you ever forget that. I'll tell you that every day if I have to." The arm around her shoulder tightened and she leaned her head against his side with a soft sniff and jerked her head in a faint nod. It still hurt, and she knew it would hurt for a long time to come, but she was thankful to the blonde beside her because he made the future not seem so suffocating anymore. She felt a little guilty and silently apologized in her head to the number one hero, because Toshinori-sen was quickly replacing him in her heart. Small legs kicked on a neatly made bed and a head of dark brown hair was bent over something. "Yu-chan, dinner time." The voice made the boy jerk and he pushed himself up, swiftly folding the photo up and stuffing it between his mattress and box frame before pushing himself from the bed and out of the room. He'd hide it better than he got back. Blue eyes cracked open and squinted through the blur to focus on the clock, and he let out a huff when he realized it was 9. Well, there goes his sleep schedule. Idly he wondered why he was so warm before something shifted against him, and startled Blue glanced down before he relaxed as the events from earlier came rushing back. Right, the kid. He wasn't used to feeling something like that. When Hana said she had been given up, he never made the connection that he perhaps should have in regards to it. And then Izumi had shared those details, and a hot ball of anger had been incubating in his chest ever since. He had had the insane urge to go over to the door where the girl's mother lived. Do something. He didn't know what, and that scared him. He was used to feeling righteous anger, had felt annoyed plenty of times. But the one time he had gotten angry like this, he had pulled something stupid and landed with an injury in his side. Which, yeah, the anger wasn't as intense as that, but it made him uneasy to be feeling it towards a civilian, a harmless woman that he could easily break with a normal punch in his one-for-all form. He was a hero, though, and having feelings like that weren't very heroic. Didn't make him want to punch someone or something, though. The sobs the girl had let out damn near broke his heart. He was supposed to look out for her, protect her. He had done a shit job of it so far, in his opinion. Leaning his head back against the couch, he held in a wince when the girl shifted and leaned further into his injured side. It wasn't enough to hurt per se, but it ached. It wasn't anything he couldn't handle, though. He had gone through much worse by the time he was 16. "What am I going to do, Nana-sensei?" Nothing answered him, and he didn't know why he was seeking help from her. All the times he had asked before hadn't done anything. How was he supposed to protect her heart when everything around them seemed to be geared towards tearing the poor girl down? It had barely been a full day and a half since he had signed those papers, and it felt like everything was hitting them at once, and he felt like he was grasping at straws. Why had he thought this would be cut and dried? Why did he think it was going to be easy? It wasn't. It wasn't going to be easy. It had been spelled out for him and underlined in red when he came around that corner and saw her breaking down in the entranceway. It had been laid out for him like her emotions, and before he had just been pulling words from the air without really thinking about them. It had almost been like playing house. But this wasn't pretend. This girl relied on him now, and Naomasa's words echoed in his head like a gavel, and he shut his eyes as his shoulders slumped. He had never thought about family much, either about his own besides fanciful dreams when he was younger, and as he got older it was just too dangerous for him to have one. Nana-sensei's situation had only hammered it home. And while it was still dangerous, he thought he could handle it. Endeavor had already had his 4th child, and if the number 2 hero could raise a family without trouble, he should be able to, right? But maybe he had underestimated the number 2's character. To be able to handle a child's needs was no small feat. He wondered if the man would give him some advice. As a more experienced family man to a new father, he would have to ask discreetly. A wiggle against his side drew his attention, and without realizing his own actions, he had placed his arm around the girl's shoulders and drew her closer, snagging the blanket thrown over the edge of the couch and drawing it over them both. It couldn't hurt to catch a few more minutes of sleep, and as long as she needed it, Toshinori would be there. He'd be there forever if she needed it. And he wondered if this was what an actual father felt. He could only hope his fumbled attempts didn't fall short. The days following her meltdown were more comfortable, believe it or not. Before it was like they were walking on eggshells around each other, but now that they had been baptized in her tears and snot, it seemed they had grown closer. She found it was easier to ask him for help with her homework when she found some parts difficult. And he was a wellspring of help when it came to her English homework, as apparently he had lived there for a few years. The hair ruffles and the pats on her shoulder were nice too. They made something warm in her chest blossom more every day, and she got calls from Hana-san to check up on her. It was nice to know the woman hadn't closed herself off from Izumi now that the girl was out of her hair. When she woke up that time after falling asleep next to the blonde, he had asked her if she would feel better moving to a different place, but she had refused. How could she be a good hero if she ran from everything all the time? It's not bad to avoid things that hurt you, Izumi. His words had seemed to be spoken from experience, and it was nice to know he didn't think any less of her, but she still didn't feel like they had to move away. She didn't want to burden him with the thought of having to find another apartment. She just had to leave a little earlier and take the stairs when she got back. It was no big deal. Getting back into her after-school workout routine made her a bit more relaxed. Hana-san had said that having something normal to fall back on when her life seemed a bit hectic was good for her emotional well-being. And Toshinori-san said that as long as she kept him updated about her whereabouts it was fine. But her curfew was 6:30 p.m., which was when the sun was going down and it would get dark soon. She didn't mind. She understood that even if the Hero Academy was nearby and there were a lot of pro-heroes around, that didn't mean there wasn't any crime. Hana-san and the other workers at the orphanage had been even more strict, making her come back at 5:30 p.m. instead. Toshinori-san didn't mind if she was a few minutes late either, allowing that she might be distracted as she usually was with her hero analysis books, but that he would text a reminder to her at 6:15 to get her attention and expected a text back. It was nice to know he cared about her enough to worry. Going to and from school made her run into Yudai every once in a while. The younger boy was always thrilled to see her, and it made her wonder what kind of impression she had left on the boy to make him so friendly towards her. He still made her nervous, but after talking with Toshinori-san she didn't feel as antsy around the boy. Less like she was going to burst into tears, and instead she found they shared a love for heroes, especially a certain number one. It was nice to bond with him over something, even if they could never really have a proper sibling relationship. As the weeks progressed, she no longer felt anxiety over the thought of her mother living so close. After talking with Hana-san about it, it was put in plain terms that the woman couldn't really do anything even if she wanted to. As far as Hana-san saw, there was no reason to pull her from Toshinori-san's care, and it would only hurt her emotionally if something like that were to happen. So no, her mother couldn't and wouldn't ever be able to get custody over her. And the same went for her father if he tried, as he had also signed the papers. It had been a weird and irrational fear of hers, the thought of being taken away from Toshinori-san. And she wondered when her heart had latched so strongly onto the thin man but couldn't bring herself to regret it. Before, it had been her dream for her mother to come back and take her home, to apologize and tell Izumi that she loved her, but now she didn't have that feeling anymore, didn't crave her mother's touch or hug, didn't wish for that life anymore. She had one with Toshinori-san. The park was nice at this time of day. The sun was unusually warm, and Toshinori-san said he would be a tad later than usual because he had gone to speak with a colleague. She wondered where he worked, but he had only said he worked at a hero agency, and avoided the rest of the conversation. She wondered if he had ever met All Might, and if so, he could possibly get her an autograph. She had finally managed to get all her posters up, and Toshinori-san had called the collection impressive with the oddest look on his face, but he didn't really seem to mind it too much. While she wondered what heroes he had possibly met, a sound like firecrackers going off startled her, and she looked up. Green eyes going wide, she shot up, notebook falling to the ground behind her as her feet carried her forward. The coffee was nice. Even nicer was the fact the mug fit his large hands and the chair didn't threaten to fall out from beneath him. "So you have a kid?" The words were practically growled, and the blonde let out a slightly nervous laugh. "You caught me. It was kind of sudden, but she's a good girl." The red-haired man grunted and took a drink of his own coffee, and they both glanced over the railing to the courtyard of the number 2's traditional house to watch his youngest son run after his two older brothers. The boy was around his girl's age actually, with two-toned hair split evenly down the middle. Kids are usually sudden. Then they tend to cause nothing but trouble until they get old enough to leave the house. The gruff words would have been off-putting if there was actual heat in them, but for a man with a quirk like his they were at most lukewarm. "And yet you have 4, so they can't be all that bad." Turquoise eyes stared at him in a deadpan look. "Or the sex could just be that good," he said, and Toshinori coughed violently, turning his head in time to not douse the other man in the liquid, and he tasted a faint hint of blood in the back of his throat as heat crept up his cheeks, and he pressed a hand to his face as a rough laugh escaped the redhead. "Really? Why do you always do that, NG? Every damn time." "Because it amuses me, obviously." "Smug bastard." "NG, stop teasing him." The soft voice drew both pairs of eyes to the white-haired woman who had come up to join them, one hand on her hip while the other held a towel, no doubt already prepared for a situation like this. "It's good for him. Keeps his ass humble." All Might sent the other man a look before checking the time and sending off a quick text to Izumi to remind her that she needed to start heading home. "Look at you. You're like a mother hen. Never thought I'd see the day you got broody." The blonde looked up with narrowed eyes. "I still have pictures of you holding Fayumi, you know. You were crying, NG, sobbing. I have video, and I'm not afraid to use it." The white-haired woman laughed, head thrown back as red crept across the other man's face, and he crossed his arms with a scowl but didn't comment. "He's got you, NG. We both know." Despite moving out, "Fayumi still has you wrapped around her finger," the man grumbled, but All Might turned his attention to his phone. 6:14 p.m. "It's getting late, Izumi. I'll be arriving back soon and start dinner." It was currently 6:19 and he felt a creeping feeling in the void where his stomach wasn't and sent off another text. 6:20 p.m. Izumi. Oh might. He glanced up at Shori and managed to smile. Ah, Izumi's not answering and she snorted loudly. It's normal, she's what, 12 or 13? She's in her bratty years. Expect her to be rebellious. Perhaps the other man was right. He was the more experienced man. Still, something made his instincts perk up and take notice. Izumi had always replied within a minute. For her not to made everything in him prick to attention. Pushing the call button, he held the phone up and ignored Inji's exaggerated eye roll and felt amusement when Shori slapped the back of the man's head. Hi, if you're hearing this, I wasn't able to pick up. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. The automated answer set his teeth on edge and now he felt his heart beginning to race. He was just paranoid. She was fine. Maybe you should head home. She might be there already, Shori said cautiously, and even Inji seemed a bit more alert, back straight instead of slouched into the steel chair beneath him. Right, you're right. She might be back and in the shower or something. He nodded and stood only for his phone to ring. He fumbled it badly and hit the answer button and brought the phone to his ear quickly. Izumi. But the voice that answered him made his shoulders slump. Kashinori, we have a situation. Naomasa's sharp voice told him it was hero business and his mind skittered and he pinched the bridge of his nose. Does it have to be me? Izumi's not answering her phone and I have to check on her. He was already prepared to hurry back home when Naomasa's next words made him stop. It might be because we found her cell phone in a destroyed park. We have reason to believe that she and another student from her school have been kidnapped. And just like that, his world fell apart. Her head hurt. That was the first thing she noticed as her world trickled back into being in flashes of light and sound. Her back was warm and something moved against her hands, a tightness around her wrists that was uncomfortable, and her eyebrows pulled together before she cracked open her eyes and winced. It wasn't even that bright in the room, and yet it still made her head pound and her stomach rolled slightly. She felt like her head had been smashed into concrete. Flashes of light, the sweet scent of some chemical, and her heart racing in her chest before a fist collected her in her temple, and the world was made of darkness and shadows and then nothing at all. Oh, just a fist then. The full implications hit her and green eyes widened and cast around quickly. She was alone in the room and it was no more than a dirty warehouse, and she wanted to laugh at the cliche of it all but bit it back and pressed her lips together. Movement against her back almost made her vibrate out of her skin, and she twisted to look over her shoulder and managed to spy wild ash blonde hair. So she wasn't alone then. Boy, you awake? The voice was rough and she jumped at the volume. Yes, she mumbled, as if it wasn't obvious. You a special kind of stupid. I had the situation handled. She stared in front of her and wondered at her luck before pressing her face against the dirt floor. Yeah, I saw that. Her words were terribly dry as she remembered his face pressed completely into the grass, both his hands pressed to his sides so he couldn't use his quirk. You trying to say something? She hissed as he jerked, and she realized then their hands were bound together, duct tape wrapping around them, no doubt so he didn't use his power, otherwise he risked injuring himself and her. I'm trying to say that you couldn't have possibly taken down 5 adults while another sat on your back and doused you with water? Yes. Forgive me for using my brain and connecting the dots. The words were harshly whispered and she groaned and pressed her face against the ground again. Great, just great. Why did it have to start now? Why? The boy tied behind her growled but remained silent. She could only hope her words had gotten through to him. Meanwhile, she begged her body to not do anything rash and dearly hoped the irrational anger was just a stress thing. Yes, it had to be a stress thing. She really wanted Toshinori here right now. But he wasn't here, and if he was, she'd be worried. From what she had seen just before, the large muscled one had decked her in the head. 2 had strength quirks. 1 had a water-based quirk, and the other 2 she didn't have the foggiest about. They all had tattoos though, and she could only guess they were part of a Yakuza group. Add in the fact they were bound and unharmed, she figured they needed them for something. Either they needed them both, or they needed her to stop the boy from behind her from misbehaving. From the way they bound their hands together, she guessed it was the case. So it was probably they were just targeting the blonde boy and got her as collateral. Was it possible they were trying to traffic them? The thought sent chills down her spine, but she tried to focus. There had to be a way for them to get out of this. Would you quit that damn mumbling? A foot kicked hers and she grit her teeth at the burst of anger before stomping it down and taking a deep breath. And then the door opened and the muscled one she remembers punching her walked in, and she felt the boy against her back turn rigid. Well, looks like you both are awake. Good. He approached them and she bit back a wince when hands tightened into fists around hers. Fuck off, you asshat. Her eyes widened at the foul words that came from behind her, but the man only laughed. The sound booming through the room they were in before he crouched beside them and pulled a bottle of water from his pocket. You both have gotta be thirsty. Sorry about hitting you so hard, princess, but I couldn't let you hurt Tenma anymore. Poor guy, still icing his crotch because of that kick of yours. He opened the water bottle and held it out to her, but she kept her lips sealed. He raised an eyebrow before smirking softly. Smart little cookie, aren't you? Your mama taught you good, I guess, not to take things from strangers. She pressed her lips tighter together and watched him take a drink of the water and lean back so he was sitting on the ground in front of them. Who the fuck would take something from some shit stain like you? Barked the boy from behind her, and she silently begged him to shut up. If they didn't make any trouble, they were less likely to get hurt. If they let this man talk, then they gave the authorities more time to find them. You know, it's a good thing you have so much fight in you. It'll serve you well enough down the road. People pay high dollar for brats like you just so they can have the fun of breaking that will of yours. He grinned. As for you, little girl, we still haven't decided on your fate. You might be sold off or we might keep you. You're kind of cute and I know Jin certainly seems interested in us. Be good and we'll even treat you well. Her heart was beating wildly in her chest and she was clenching her fists this time as terror sunk into her heart when the door opened and the man with the water quirk looked in. Goro, stop fucking around. We need you out here instead of playing with the brats. The large man let out a put-upon sigh before pushing himself to his feet. Sleep tight, kiddies. I'll see you in the morning. He winked at Izumi and the girl felt her stomach roll when his eyes moved over her form before he turned and left the room. A rattle coming from the door told her it was locked and she took in a slow breath. Those fuckers. When I get out of here, I'm mob blow those shit-stained sky fucking high. The boy behind her was the one mumbling now and she shifted her arms, mind racing. So they were probably going to sell the boy behind her to some underground fighting ring, and her too. Well, she didn't want to dwell on that. Can you brace yourself? Try not to move, she said, and before he could react, she pressed her arms back against him and down. The rope and tape around her wrists hurt, but she leaned her torso forward. Slowly she wiggled until her rear was through the circle of her arms and carefully threaded her legs through and was eternally glad Hana-san taught her flexibility. Now facing the boy's back, she helped him sit up and leaned over, teeth digging into the tape. Your quirk make your bones into liquid or something? He asked. A note in it she couldn't understand, and she snorted and pulled her head up to lean over and look at him with a sharp stare. I don't have a quirk. Then she leaned back down and tore the tape back with her teeth. It was wrapped around their hands several times and the angles were awkward, but she finally got enough of it off to see the rope that bound their hands together. It was thick and rough but strong, and she felt her teeth grit and tried to think of something to cut it and looked around the warehouse. Quirkless. The fuck were you doing running in that like then, you moron? She felt that anger in her chest roll and mentally counted to 10. My feet moved on their own. Now instead of bitching, can you please look around and try and find something to cut this rope? Okay, so she hadn't pushed the anger down far enough. She entirely blamed Hana-san for the language, though. She heard a faint tch from the boy, but his head moved and she kept an eye on the door. My belt. It's got a piece of sharp metal on it I never bothered getting fixed. But that's about it, he finally said, and she shuffled over, both of them twisting so she could get a look, and sure enough the buckle was metal. The question though was how they were going to go about getting it off of him and into her hands. Biting her lip, she stopped and her cheeks went pink and she looked away. I can get it off, but the boy seemed to come to the same conclusion and his red eyes widened, face twisting in a weird way before he grit his teeth. Well, I certainly don't want these bastards to win, so just get it over with so we can get the fuck out of this dump. She bit back her reply and instead nodded, moving so she could lean down and trying to ignore the fact she was this close to a boy and in such a position before carefully using her teeth to undo the belt, and it felt so dirty. I hope Toshinori never finds out about this. I hope I forget all about this. Amnesia after this would be wonderful. She didn't dare look at the boy when the belt came undone, and she gripped the metal in her molars and pulled it from the loops, moving back around so she could focus on their bound hands, and tried to forget about the fact she had just had her face so close to a boy. No, it didn't happen. Nope. Metal smooth in her hand, she felt along it until she found the rough side and pressed it into the rope. There, wiggling it had loosened it enough to where she could pull their hands apart a little bit and saw at the fibers. Is it at least working? The voice was abnormally subdued from his last words and she felt her fingers cramping. Yeah, it's just a little slow, but it's working. Some of the strands had frayed and she glanced over her shoulder at the door and grit her teeth, moving her hand a little quicker. There was no telling if one of their captors would show up again, and if they went to such great lengths to stop this boy from using his quirk, then it had to be powerful. And there were windows higher up in the warehouse. If they tried, they could crawl out of one and run. The metal cut into her fingers and hurt, but she didn't let that stop her. She was so close, and as the rope unraveled, it felt like any second someone would come in and find them. But then the rope snapped and no one came in, and she let out a shaky breath, dropping the belt and rubbing her wrists as the boy leapt up and glared towards the door like it had personally insulted him. When he took a step forward, her eyes widened and she leapt up, hand gripping his sleeve. Are you crazy? You're just asking to get caught again. I have their faces memorized, and it's better if we just leave out a window and find some police." He shrugged her off roughly and glared over at her, but she did not have the patience for this shit. Hana-san had rubbed off on her more than she thought, it seemed. "TCH. Fine," he finally grumbled, and she nodded and moved towards the ladder leading up to the walkway where the windows were. Climbing up as the boy grabbed his belt, and she tried not to watch as he pulled it back on. The windows were large and there was no way to open them. Glancing out, she saw they were surrounded by other decrepit buildings. Out of the way. She was shoved to the side and barely kept her footing before a loud explosion shattered the glass. "You call me the idiot." They probably heard that. She didn't bother controlling her volume. After that racket, what was the point? "Then I guess we better get our asses moving." Quirkless, she glared at his back as he held out a hand. Oddly touched at the fact he wanted to help her, she ignored it and instead jumped from the window and rolled to lessen the impact. The glass had fallen straight down instead of out, so she didn't have to worry about being cut, and beside her the boy let out a slight grunt when he hit the ground but pushed himself up. It looked like it got more inhabited that way. She pointed to the northeast-ish. And he grunted again, and she wondered if he had regressed to caveman talk when they both heard loud shouts from inside the building. Green met red before they both took off, and she felt her heart in her throat when a large crash sounded behind them. She was scared. She knew if they caught them again that it wouldn't be pleasant, and it frightened her so bad she felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't afford to have her vision impaired at a time like this. Beside her the boy had his teeth bared, and she tried to think before her eyes went to his hand and remembered how loud that explosion was. How large of an explosion can you make? She panted and red eyes slanted towards her. Depends. She found she didn't like boys, or at least ones her age, because they were so annoying. Do you think you can aim one straight up and make it as noticeable as possible? The look on the blonde's face was clear in regards to her ideal. Do you want to lead those fuckers straight to us? Cause that's what that'll do, moron. She glanced behind her and saw the thugs, Yakuza, villains behind them, but there were only 3. No, I want to notify all the heroes in the area something's happening over here. If they see a giant explosion, they'll come investigate it. Her words were very nearly a yell of frustration, and red eyes widened before he suddenly stopped, and she nearly tripped over her red sneakers and looked over to him. He was cupping his hands and muttering to himself before looking at her. "You want an explosion? Fucking fine. You better shut your damn eyes, brat." She quickly did as told before a sudden oppressive heat slammed into her body. Hair whipping around her face as light flared red from beyond her closed lids, and her ears rang, and she realized she probably should have covered them as well. Falling to her knees, she finally cracked her eyes open and coughed at the smoke that rolled towards the sky. The boy was panting for breath and his hands were shaking. Head ducked, no doubt trying to save his own vision. That had been terrifying. Just how strong is this boy? She pushed herself to her feet and began moving again, stumbling forward, and his red eyes were open and looking towards where their pursuers were, but smoke was still covering everything. "We have to keep moving." Her voice sounded muddled to her own ears as there was still a high-pitched keen, but he seemed to hear and glanced over with a twitch before nodding. And then something smashed into her upper back and she was sent sprawling across harsh concrete and gasped. She heard another explosion go off over her and rolled onto her back to see the boy driving off a man she only vaguely recognized as the one she had kicked. Right, the other one with the strength quirk then. Pushing herself to her feet, she stumbled at her weak knees, and the sense of vertigo made her clutch the ground before a shadow fell over her and her head tilted up. Green eyes wide as the large man that had spoken to them earlier snarled down at her, his hand raised, and she ducked her head, eyes shutting as fear made her heart race, and she was so scared, and she just wanted her dad. Air suddenly pushed her hair back before a familiar voice made her stomach jolt. "You don't have to worry." "Why?" "Because I am here." Looking up, her eyes widened at someone who towered over even the large Goro. He wasn't wearing his costume, but she would recognize that silhouette anywhere. Oh might. And then he was moving and she couldn't even see him. He was suddenly in front of her, and then their captors hit the ground like puppets with their strings cut, and she shivered and looked around for the blonde boy who had been with her. He was sitting down on the ground looking shocked, even as a few other heroes arrived on scene followed by some police, and she let out a shuddering breath. They were safe. It was fine. The sight of her hero should have made her thrilled, but she could only wish for a thin man with an easy smile and a warm hug. "Yagi Izumi." The voice drew her wandering gaze to a man wearing a brown overcoat and hat. Kind black eyes stared out from under the rim, and she could see short black hair. And after a second she realized he was waiting on her answer. "Why?" Yes, her voice was soft, and he reached down and took his coat off to instead drape it over her shoulders. "Hey, you're safe now. No need to cry." She was crying. "Izumi." The voice drew her eyes, and she saw a familiar face pushing through the crowd. Without telling them to, her legs pushed her up and she was running. "Dad." And then his arms were around her and she shivered, burying her face into his chest and wrapping her arms around him desperately. And the tears wouldn't stop. "It's all right. You're safe." He was the third person to comfort her, but the only one that had any success. She didn't know why just his presence alone made the fear in her vanish, how he easily pushed it back when not even the #1 hero managed it, but found herself not caring a lick. He was there, and that mattered more to her than anything. Toshinori thought he knew fear, but nothing prepared him for the sight of Izumi, defenseless and exhausted beneath the bulk of some upstart villain. Punching him away was more satisfying than he would care to admit, and he used perhaps a bit too much strength, but one for all thrummed in his veins in time to his heartbeat. He stayed in his powered-up form just long enough to make sure the villains were secured before moving as quickly as possible away from the police and other pros. Finding an out-of-the-way corner was easy, and he slipped out of it after releasing the power that flowed through him. His heart was still pounding in his chest despite knowing that she was fine, but he couldn't help it. This instinct inside him that had only grown the more time he spent around the green-eyed girl wouldn't be satisfied until he checked her over for himself. Pushing through the crowd of police, his eyes scanned where he had saw her last and spotted her. She was sitting on the ground with Naomasa's signature coat over her shoulders, and the detective was talking with her. "Izumi." Without realizing it, he had called out. He hadn't been able to say anything to her at all in his more muscular form for fear of people finding out, but now he didn't have to keep in his worry. Pushing from the crowd, he was surprised at the fact she was already halfway to him, and he only had enough time to open his arms and brace himself before the girl plowed into him. It made pain flare like a wildfire in his side, but he didn't pay attention to that. Instead, his mind was playing something in his head like a skipping vinyl. Dad. She had called him Dad, and the feeling was like the lightest feeling in the world, but also pressed his shoulders down in a way a new jacket might. It was odd and new, but was also a surprisingly comfortable fit. "It's all right. You're safe." She was shivering in his hold, and he felt his lips tug down in worry at the dried blood on her temple and how she cried against him. "Toshinori." The voice made him look up and into Naomasa's eyes. He gave a soft smile, and the blonde found himself returning it. "We should probably get her to the ambulance to make sure she's fine." Small arms tightened around his waist, and Naomasa reached out to help him when he held out a hand and instead leaned over, one arm looping around Izumi's knees, and with a soft grunt he lifted her. His old injury practically hissed at him like an angry cat, but he ignored it when her arms went around his neck instead, and she buried her face in his shoulder. "Are you okay?" The other man's black eyes were cautious, and his hands were held out just in case, but Toshinori was he wasn't fine. His side was on fire, and he knew he was going to be feeling it later, but he wasn't about to let the green-haired girl go anytime soon. "It's fine," he said, and moved towards the ambulance. The ash-blonde boy was already there and getting his hands treated. A woman came over to them, and from her uniform he knew she was a paramedic. "Just set her down there, please." She gestured to the back of the ambulance, and he bent over and set the quiet girl down, but couldn't go far because her hand had latched onto his shirt sleeve. It was fine. He didn't feel emotionally able to get too far from her anyway. He couldn't quite get the ideal to bundle her up and hide her away to fully leave his head, either. He watched as the woman bent down and pressed a hand to Izumi's face. A soft blue glow escaped where contact was made before she was pulling back. "She's suffering from a mild concussion, but other than that she'll be fine." She brunette smiled to them both before grabbing a bag and pulling out a few items. "Everything okay?" Toshinori very nearly jumped at the voice and glanced over to Naomasa, who had somehow managed to sneak up on him. "She'll be okay. The concussion is so slight she doesn't even need to go to the hospital and can even sleep." She seemed to find what she was looking for in the bag and removed. "Chocolate." Naomasa's words echoed Toshinori's thoughts even as the woman laughed softly and opened the bar. "Your name's Izumi, right? Eat this. It'll help you feel better." The blonde watched a small hand reach out and take the bar, curling around it and nibbling at the end, and he remembered it was roughly 10 o'clock at night and she hadn't had dinner. He hadn't had dinner. And he was sure if he had a stomach it would be growling at him by now. "We're going to need statements from them both, you know." Blue eyes looked over at the detective. He knew it was true, but he still had an urge to grab Izumi and take her home. Hadn't she gone through enough without having to live through it again? Wrestling his thoughts back in order because he knew this had to happen. Knew the police needed to hear how everything went down so they could convict the criminals and put them behind bars, and wondered when his rational mind had taken a lunch break. "Around the time you got a daughter," a snarky voice drawled in his head, and he had to agree with that. He couldn't say he regretted it, though. "So can you tell me what happened?" Her mind was still muddled, but she at least didn't feel like her emotions were trying to crush her. The detective was nice, and it was easy as she explained everything that happened, from spotting a group of men in the park surrounding the blonde boy to waking up in the warehouse back to back with him. But when it came to the part on how they escaped, she found her throat closing up and her face warming, green eyes sliding towards Toshinori as her words stuttered together before stopping completely. "Izumi-san." Her eyes turned to lock with black, and a small high-pitched squeak escaped her. "Izumi?" The concern in Toshinori's voice had her feeling guilty. Pressing her hands to her face, she took in a deep breath. "I used his belt buckle," the words were mumbled, and her shoulders hunched. She missed the raised eyebrow from the detective and the slightly confused blue eyes that stared down at her. His belt buckle. Okay, no need to be embarrassed about that. Really, no reason at all. Glancing up, she looked over and saw the man was writing something down before he paused. Eyebrows furrowed in confusion. But if your hands were bound together, how did you? Oh, beside her she felt her guardian tense, and her mind shrieked hysterically as her face went past red and took on a purple color instead. And then the man laughed, head thrown back, and laughed after looking at the thin man beside her, and she risked a glance up and blanched. She had never thought Toshinori had looked scary. But with the deep shadows over his features and how his eyes seemed to glow, it was unsettling. Though the word was said flatly, and then the man stood and she let out a squeak when thin but strong arms wrapped around her and she was picked up, brown coat bundled around her several times. Toshinori, we still need the rest of her statement. The detective called and she was hoisted higher and her face blazed red. Fuck that, she blinked at the words that came from the blonde in confusion. They were English, she knew, but she couldn't understand them at all. But from the black-haired man's face she knew he did, because he let out a snort-like noise. And then the blonde was striding away, shooting a look she couldn't quite catch towards the blonde boy as they passed him, and she ducked her head into Toshinori's shoulder in mortification. Toshinori, that's my jacket. The detective's voice called out behind them, and she glanced up to look behind them before looking back down. She could only really move her hands because she had practically been wrapped up like a burrito in the large coat. Thank you for your donation. Izumi appreciates it. She had never heard Toshinori's voice get that loud before. The booming quality of it was so familiar. You don't have to worry. Why? Because I am here. A tall form that was familiar. He wasn't in his hero uniform, but instead a large white shirt and tan cargo pants. She was completely silent as her eyes looked down at the baggy white shirt that clothed the man's form and the equally baggy cargo pants, a belt looping around his hips that was the exact same. She found her eyes sliding up to the blaze of sunshine yellow hair beside her, and her heart was pounding in her chest and her hands clenched in the white cotton beneath them. It was impossible, right? Toshinori was Toshinori. He couldn't be. All Might was strong in. You said a fight, so you used to be a hero then? She asked, and he gave a soft hum and nodded as he folded the towel and sat it on his knee. Yeah, it was rough, but I managed to win, though I obviously didn't get away unscathed. He gestured to himself with a wry smile before it dropped. Frantically, she cast her mind back 3 years and swallowed thickly. 3 years ago, All Might had disappeared from the public for roughly 5 months. And when he got back to hero work, he had never been as active again. All Might, she finally said, and felt the man holding her go rigid, and she gulped. I didn't manage to get his autograph. She finally got out and felt the lean muscles along his shoulders relax before a soft chuckle escaped him, but she could now hear the note of nervousness in it. It's okay, Izumi. I'm sure you'll get a chance, and hey, I work closely with them. I might be able to get one for you. She let out a hum and buried her face into his shoulder again. He continued on, and once he got to a more populated place, he waved down a taxi, and she was placed on her feet and got in. Her source of inner turmoil got in beside her and had to sit almost completely scrunched, and she wondered if he would be as tall as his other form if he didn't slouch so much. Because she knew now, it was so obvious when he had tensed. Yagi Toshinori was All Might, and he was her adopted father. She didn't really know how to process that. Arriving back at the apartment didn't take long, and once they were inside, she felt an invisible weight lift from her shoulders. The large brown coat from the detective was still wrapped around her, and she pulled it off. Glancing up to Toshinori, she bit her lip. Are you angry with me? The silence since he had found out had been almost oppressive, and it made her stomach twist in a weird way. Wah. No. Suddenly Toshinori was kneeling down, and both her shoulders were taken in his hands. I'm not upset with you, Izumi. I was scared and still am, if only a little bit. The thought of what could have happened to you. He cut himself off, and she felt her eyes go wide at his words. I care about you a lot. I started us on this path impulsively, but it doesn't mean that I've done it lightly either. I'm supposed to protect you, and I failed in that duty. I failed you when you were taken by those men. Even before his words had ended, she was shaking her head and clutching the jacket in her hands tightly. It wasn't. How could he think that? It wasn't your fault, though. It wasn't anyone's fault but theirs, right? You is your quirk, Foresight. Her words were wobbly from tears, but she was able to see the confused look cross his features. Foresight. Oh no, she sniffed loudly and rubbed at her eyes with her palm. Then you couldn't have known it was going to happen, so don't blame yourself for someone else's actions. You can't hold the world on your own shoulders all the time, Dad. Blue eyes stared at her in shock before his head ducked and a slight smile pulled at his mouth. Well, with a talk like that, how can I argue? Ah, but I've made you cry again, haven't I, Izumi? She was drawn to his chest and snuggled into his embrace, using the jacket to rub at her eyes when her hands grew to damp, and a strong hand rubbed her back before she was picked up yet again. One hand on her back and the other beneath her knees, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They entered the living room, and she was set down on the couch while he settled beside her with a long drawn-out sigh, eye on the clock and a wry expression twisting his features. It doesn't seem you or I will be getting up on time. Do you want to go into school or stay home? I figure if it's one day it will be all right. Izumi glanced over at the clock and cringed faintly. It was 12:42 a.m. and by the time they ate and got into bed it would be well past 1 a.m. If it's okay, I'd like to stay, and she felt the couch shift and glanced over to see him leaning forward and reaching in his pocket to pull out his cell phone. In that case, how about a pizza? I'm too tired to cook right now anyway. Curious as he opened a website on his phone, she crawled over and leaned against his shoulder to see a pizza website pulled up. I've only had pizza once. I didn't realize there were so many types, and why did so many of them have corn of all things on them? Only once. When I was in the States it was almost a staple. What kind did you have? He scrolled up to the order button and she pointed. That looks like it. It was really cheesy, but that was about it. Her finger was over classic cheese and he snorted. It's just flat bread with a little sauce. Now this is a pizza. He pointed to one called a Meat Lovers that boasted sausage, bacon and a few others, and she tilted her head and pointed to a different one. What's that one? He clicked the image and at the same time their heads tilted to the side. Are those crab claws? She asked and his eyebrows furrowed. It looks like it. It has mayo. I haven't really ordered a lot of pizzas and always stick with my usual, so I haven't really looked through these. They scrolled through the different pizzas for a while and found they only grew weirder. Takoyaki, honey octopus, and one that looked like a minivan. Can we maybe try that? Her eyebrows furrowed before pointing at one. The quattro meat max? He asked and she nodded, unused to the foreign word. Quattro means four in Italian. I think. He scratched at his head and thought before shrugging. Or Spanish. But I might be thinking of a different word altogether. He hit the order button and it took them to a different page, and he ordered a medium which had 8 slices. I usually just get the regular crust. Is that okay, or do you want a different one? She shook her head and shuffled closer, chin resting on his shoulder as he hit the checkout button and put in their information, and before long a small bar popped up with cheerful words of how they were making their pizza. It should be here in about 30 minutes or so. The pizza place isn't that far away. He relaxed back and she sat up before looking down at herself. She was rather dusty and dirty from her ordeal. I think I'll go take a shower. She picked at a piece of dried mud on her wrist and he gave a nod and she looked worriedly at him. He looked exhausted actually, and she wondered just how much it took out of him to be who he was during work hours. Pushing herself up, she scooted forward on her knees and wrapped her arms around his neck in a hug, cheeks a little warm. Thank you, Dad. She didn't specify what she was thanking him for and instead released him and pushed herself to her feet before going to her room. The door shut behind her and she froze, staring at all her posters of All Might and the other pieces of merchandise scattered around the room, and a soft whimper escaped her throat, hands coming up to cover her face as she realized the implications. Her dad had seen this room. All Might had seen her room. Glancing up past her fingers, she let out a soft whine before shuffling over to her dresser and pulling out some fresh clothes, just some black shorts and a gray t-shirt. Going from her bedroom to the bathroom, she peeked into the living area and saw the blonde had begun to doze on the couch and smiled before closing the bathroom door behind her and quickly pulling off her gritty clothes and hopping into the shower to clean off. Once she was done, she pulled on her clothes and dried her hair quickly before stepping out of the bathroom and going into the laundry room to set her soiled clothes into the hamper. Grabbing her hairbrush from her room, she pulled it through her hair as she walked into the living area and saw the blonde was out. Green eyes blinking slowly at the even and deep breaths, she cautiously made her way behind the couch and peeked down at him. His head was laying on the back and now his eyes weren't shadowed by his brows, and for some reason she expected him to have raccoon markings there because of how dark they usually were. But they were just really deep set, which was what a normal person would assume, and yet Izumi thought her adopted dad had a raccoon mask. Shaking the stupid thought from her head, she eyed his wild hair and then the clock before slanting a glance at her hairbrush. She could let him sleep as there was about 15 minutes left before the pizza got there. Biting her lip, she wondered for a second if she was overstepping some sort of boundary before lifting her brush and carefully gathering some of the sunshine hair into her hand. Peeking at his face, she found he was still asleep, deep even breaths rasping out of a slightly open mouth, and she bit her lip before getting to work. A knock on the door made her glance up and the sleeping form on the couch jerked, blue eyes shooting open to blink up at the ceiling before a large yawn overtook him and he shook his head. I fell asleep, he asked and glanced towards her. She offered a sheepish smile and shrugged, and he returned her smile with a much more cheery one before he pushed himself from the couch with a grunt, and Izumi ducked her head back down, teeth biting into her bottom lip to stop herself from saying anything, and instead focused on her hero analysis book and the entry therein. Tapping her pen on the page, she glanced up when she heard the front door close, and then her dad walked in, pizza box in hand, and not a clue as to the state of his hair. She hadn't done anything bad to it. There weren't any bows or anything, it just was tied back. That was it really. She had brushed it out and pinned it back in a clip. One of his long bangs was tucked behind an ear. She wondered how he hadn't noticed. Dinner is served. He grinned and she gave him an unsure one in return as anxiety crept into her stomach. What if she had gone too far? What if he was upset that she had messed with his hair? She had always styled the other kids' hair at the orphanage when she was trying to calm her nerves, but now that she had done it, it seemed it had only increased them instead of put her more at ease. Izumi. He had placed the pizza box down and tilted his head to the side, one hand going up to scratch at his head before his eyes blinked quickly and he patted at his head. Wah. He pulled out his phone and no doubt turned it to camera mode and held it out. His look was TFT. Her hand smacked into her own mouth so fast it stung and she ducked her head, eyes wide and heart pounding. There was a nauseating mix of hilarity and worry, but when another laugh echoed hers, she felt a ball of tension in her stomach loosen. I've never seen my hair look like this before. He folded his legs together and sat down on the floor beside the coffee table with her. I was a little worried how you would react. To be honest, she fiddled with her hands and her stomach gave a sudden growl when the smell from the box got to her and the blonde snickered. Trust me, I've had weirder things pulled on me. This is nice actually. Usually when I brush my hair it gets worse. Somehow he waved a hand and opened the box, shuffling it so the lid laid flat like a plate, and she got to her knees and leaned up to look at it curiously. Well, dig in. We've both missed dinner. He picked up a slice and she reached out and was unsure which she grabbed until she bit into it and found it was the galbai. It was also really, really good, and she just then realized how hungry she was. Her stomach was practically a black hole in her torso. She went through 3 slices before slowing down, instead nibbling on her last slice while the blonde beside her picked up his second. Feeling better? He asked, and after swallowing her last bite she nodded and flushed slightly. Yes, and she didn't necessarily mean just the food. She felt completely relaxed despite being in such a precarious position not but a few hours ago. It was nice and very comfortable to sit with her dad and enjoy an evening. Well, early morning. Did this count as breakfast then? They put the remaining slices of pizza away in companionable silence, and by the end of it, with a full stomach and all the emotional and physical exertion, she was half stumbling in the general direction of her bedroom, only staying upright by a hand on her shoulder that guided her to her room, and she felt a flare of embarrassment once again as all the eyes stared down at them both from the walls and figurines on her shelves. Her bedspread was suddenly a lot more bright than she had first thought, and she wondered just how the man himself felt to be in such a room. She wasn't able to dwell on it as she was led to her bed and laid down and couldn't help a soft sigh and cracked her eyes open when a soft chuckle escaped from the blonde even as he sat on the edge of her bed and pulled the sheets up around her shoulders. Blue eyes looking down at the designs, and she felt her cheeks heat again at the amusement in his eyes. Only now she knew why he was so amused by it. It was him after all. Sleep well, Izumi. I'll set an alarm and call your school. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay home, though his mouth tugged down in a frown. I wish I could, but the office needs me there. I'll only be a phone call away, though. All right. She nodded before rolling to her side so she faced him. Try and be careful. And eat lunch, and not those cheap gas shop snacks either. And no soda. Drink tea instead. She couldn't continue because he was laughing, and she felt a slight smile tug her lips up in response. Yes, though be careful. It's only an office job, Izumi. His smile was bright, but she noticed he wasn't looking directly at her. I know, she whispered and felt her hands clench beneath the covers. But be careful anyway, okay? He nodded and reached a hand out to run through her hair before he stood. I'll be careful. Now get some sleep. I'll see you tomorrow. She gave a soft affirmative and watched his silhouette as he exited her room. There was a moment before the door shut that she remembered a different one from a few hours ago. Slowly her green eyes shut and she curled underneath her bed covers with her thoughts on the man who took her in and the question that echoed in her head. Green eyes squinted open and she stared blurrily at the curtains that allowed streams of sunlight in and grumbled. One hand raising to rub at an eye, and she stretched with a yawn before flopping bonelessly across her mattress and stared to her right. The All Might poster that stared back was a familiar sight before green eyes widened and she yelped and jerked back before a screech escaped her as she tumbled from bed and hit the ground with a thud. Groaning softly, she rolled to her side and held her elbow where she had knocked it into the floor before pushing herself up and running a hand through her green hair. It was hopelessly tangled, and she pushed herself to her feet before shuffling towards her desk and grabbed her phone. Unlocking the screen, she squinted down at the time while scratching at an itch on her stomach and found it was 11 o'clock. She had slept in pretty late, but she had gone to bed around 2 in the morning. Pushing her door open, she looked around curiously. But the house was silent. Dad. Her voice seemed to echo in the apartment, and she shuffled out and found a note on the coffee table. Went to work. I'll be back around 1:30. Feel free to finish off the pizza if you want. And there was a badly drawn bunny of all things on it, but she found a smile tugging at her lips before she tilted her head and glanced towards the hallway leading to the bedrooms. She was smart, she knew. Hana-san had beat it into her head not to underestimate herself, but she had also taught her not to overestimate herself either, and while all clues led to her dad being All Might, she didn't have proof besides some very telling actions. Still, it was a big violation of privacy, wasn't it? But what if she falsely accused him? What if he was just a really big fan of All Might as well and she was just jumping to conclusions? She would only know for sure if she checked. Walking down the hallway, she got to a door that was shut and she had never been behind and reached out. The door was unlocked and she pushed open the door and crept in, poking her head in first to glance around before shuffling inside. The room was furnished with a few items. It held a desk with a very comfortable but large chair, and the bed was huge, but then again her dad was a tall man. A mini fridge sat in one corner of the room, and her eyes turned towards a door that was no doubt the closet, and she walked towards it. Glancing behind her, she leaned back a bit and peeked down the hallway. Nothing. She hadn't heard the door open either, and it was barely 11:14. Letting out a slow breath, she reached out and opened the closet and saw different clothes and got a face full of the familiar scent of fabric softener that they used. Running a hand along the t-shirts in different colors and eyeing the equally large pants, she carefully pushed back the long coats for winter and saw a flash of bright red. Gulping softly, she reached out and her hand met a tougher material than cotton, and when she pulled, she saw white and circle. She recognized it, and from the feel it was authentic. She'd know All Might's Silver Age costume anywhere. She even had an action figure dressed in this very same one. Taking a deep breath, she made sure everything was as she found it and shut the door and turned around, back pressed against the closet door, and found she was shaking. All Might was her dad. Leaving the room, she shut the door behind her and headed to her room and walked towards her bed. Her dad was All Might. Reaching down, she grabbed her pillow and pressed it to her face before taking a deep breath. And then she screamed at the top of her lungs. After doing it a few more times, she bonelessly collapsed onto her floor and flushed scarlet at all the blue eyes staring down at her and groaned, dragging the pillow to cover her burning face. Her dad had seen her room. "Look, Izumi, I managed to meet All Might and asked him for an autograph for you. Izumi." A strangled noise was his only answer, and alarm flashed through him. Izumi. After her minor freak out over the fact her dad was the #1 hero, she didn't know how to act. Did she tell him she knew? Would he be upset with his secret revealed? Of course he would. Would he give her up because of it? She trusted him. She knew he was earnest in the fact that this was her home, but she was still scared of how he would react. It was one of the rare occasions where she had gotten home before her dad. She had finished most of her homework if just to keep her thoughts from overrunning her mind, but after a while she found she couldn't focus and had read the same question no less than 11 times. She had given up and settled into the couch, and here she sat. Pulling her cell phone out, she pulled up the news and stared in shock. Because there was her dad, smashing a villain in the face with his signature smile. And she felt her stomach make this odd jumping motion, like she was at the top of a roller coaster that was about to drop. Leaning forward, she turned on the television and switched it to the news so it mirrored what was on her phone before she bit her lip and opened up a chat between her and her dad. 5:43 p.m. "Hey Dad, what do you want for dinner?" She watched as the pro hero seemed to jerk subtly on screen and wondered where this brazen side of herself had come from as the hero discreetly looked at his phone. 5:45 p.m. "Anything is fine." She bit her lip before quickly getting off the couch and turning so the TV was present in the background, and held up a victory sign and made sure her grin was blinding as she snapped a picture. 5:47 p.m. "Guess what? All Might was just on the news and he took down this really scary villain. Hope you're being careful." And there she was, smile bright in the TV in the background, with a familiar hero looking down at a small device in his hands. She watched as said hero jerked and glanced towards the camera, and it looked like he was staring at her through the screen. Her heart was beating like a hummingbird's. 5:50 p.m. "That's wonderful, Izumi. Thank you for the picture." Slightly incredulously, she stared at her phone and looked back at the TV. All Might was laughing at some reporters. She was trying to be obvious. This was the best way she could think of to tell him as gently as she could. Glancing over his figure, she noticed something. 5:52 p.m. "You have some dirt on your left cheek." The blonde hero glanced down and then lifted his hand to wipe at his face before freezing entirely and whipping around before slowly turning his head towards the reporter who was asking him what was wrong. 5:54 p.m. "Izumi." She couldn't contain the nervous giggle as she typed her reply. 5:55 p.m. "Hi Dadum, you might want to tell the reporters you're fine. They look worried. Love you and talk with you when you get home by lesser than 3. Shutting the chat and turning her phone off, she chucked it at the couch with a squeak and peeked at the screen to see her dad tucking the phone away and smiling at the reporters, telling him it had just been alerted that something else was happening and he had to go. She stared at the space where he had been and settled on the couch, a sense of impending doom looming. The hysterical giggle she released suddenly startled her, and she covered her face with her hands. In front of her, the reporters were talking about the villain being taken into custody and how the day was saved thanks to All Might. But after seeing the man behind the hero at 5 a.m. in pink sweatpants, a neon green shirt, and red bunny slippers, she couldn't bring herself to feel the same amount of awe. He was amazing and her dad, and she loved him. But he was the biggest dork she had ever met, and she knew this one kid who seemed to have a quirk that made him tell the worst jokes in the world. She heard the door open and took a deep breath, legs pulled to her chest and arms around them as she waited, and heard familiar shuffled footsteps. Tilting her head back, she glanced up and gulped at the serious look the man sported. He was in his yellow pinstriped business suit. Blue eyes flickered to where the television was and he released a bone-weary sigh before he came over and sat beside her. "When did you find out?" He finally grumbled and she bit her lip, heart pounding, and she ducked her head. "When you rescued me and that boy from the Yakuza, you were carrying me, and when you yelled you sounded the same, and well, you were wearing the same clothes. And you mentioned you had been hurt 3 years ago, and 3 years ago All Might was gone from the public eye for a few months. And when he returned he wasn't as active, and after the kidnapping thing I noticed All Might was only sighted doing hero work when you were gone," and she cut herself off and felt guilt eating away at her heart. "I was pretty sure, but I had to make sure. I didn't want to falsely accuse you of anything, so I looked in your closet, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to invade your privacy. Please don't hate me." She tried to make herself as small as possible, and tears were making her vision blurry. Startled when an arm wrapped around her shoulders and she was tugged into the man's side. "I could never hate you, Izumi, so get that thought out of your head right now." She gulped and nodded, not once lifting her head. "I haven't said it, and maybe I should have, but I do love you. You're my daughter even if we don't share the same blood, and nothing will change that, all right?" Tears were pouring down her face and she hiccuped but nodded again. Feeling the arm tighten around her, she tried to calm down her crying and rubbed at her eyes. "I should have expected this, honestly. You are a very intelligent girl, and I think I was a bit overconfident thinking I could hide that part of me from you for so long. To be honest, I'm a tad embarrassed at how easily I was found out." She sniffled and glanced up to see him facing away, one hand rubbing at his head before he tilted his head, and blue eyes glanced down at her. And he didn't look angry. The expression was amused and faintly fond, and she flushed when she realized it was because it was aimed at her, and buried her face back into his side. "Anyway, I guess I should explain fully. You already know it, but yes, I'm All Might. I can only hold that form though for 4 hours each day. The rest of the time, well," he gestured at himself almost flamboyantly, and she quirked her lips up in a faint smile. "But yeah, I'd say not to tell anyone, but I figured you can guess that." She was already nodding even before he had finished, and wrapped her arms around his waist to hug him tightly. Avoiding a place on his side she had learned hurt him, and instead snuggling close. "I'll never tell. My lips are sealed," he laughed, and long fingers combed through her hair, and she glanced over at the news as they speculated on what had caused the number one to pull his vanishing act. Without realizing it, she had begun to giggle before full-blown laughter escaped her as she remembered her dad's face. "Izumi." Amusement laced the blonde's voice, and she quieted down to soft giggles. "I'm sorry, Dad, but your face. When I texted you, your face." Blue eyes widened before he snorted and joined in her laughter. They only calmed down when her dad suddenly spurted blood, and she was so used to it by now she just grabbed a cloth and held it out for him while wiping away her tears on her sleeve while he cleaned the corners of his mouth with a soft sigh. "So, you're not mad that I looked through your closet?" she asked nervously while she still had the nerve to, and saw the blonde shrug. "In retrospect, it wasn't the best hiding place. I'm not upset about it," he said easily, and she let out a slow breath as relief flooded her system. Leaning against the couch, she couldn't help the smile that tugged at her lips. It was fine, she hadn't ruined anything. And best of all, she had heard her dad say he loved her. She doubted the warmth in her chest would fade for a long, long time after that. "Hey Dad," she asked, voice soft, and he hummed and reached out, switching the news off to instead pull up a program about a family of cheetahs. "I love you." To her cheeks flushed, and she felt bad when the man spat blood for the second time that day. She was just leaving her last classes when her phone buzzed in her skirt pocket, and she fished out her cell and opened it up. 3:18 p.m. "I'll be home when you get here. I've got your favorite, so hurry back soon." "Greater than," she snorted loudly. Ever since last week when she revealed she knew about his hero persona, her dad had been using that All Might emoji almost constantly, especially when he was excited about something. Like she had said, a big dork. Texting a quick reply, she put her phone back into her pocket and hefted her backpack higher and turned only to let out a shrill yelp at narrow red eyes that stared her down, and she felt her heart pounding rapidly in her chest. "You look stupid today." She stared at him in shock and a little bit of hurt as he snorted and then stomped away from her, and she could only stare at his back. Rubbing at her neck, she shook her head and left the school, perking up when she thought of her dad and couldn't stop her smile. No matter what Bakugo said, she was determined to be happy today. Her dad was at the apartment waiting on her with sushi. She loved sushi, and he only ever got it for her because he didn't like it that much. Skipping down the street, she hummed to herself before pausing outside of a store and staring inside. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled her wallet out and checked how much money she had before wondering, and then looking over the different shirts and looked for the largest one available. Her dad usually wore 4 or 5XL, and she managed to find one in a 4 and smiled brightly before checking the tag and the amount of money she had. Seeing as she had just enough for a shirt, she walked over to the shirts in her size and found one in her size and that matched the other one. Smile bright, she bought the items and left the store while choking down a hysterical giggle and some embarrassment. She wondered how he would react to the shirt, though. Would he wear it? Getting to the apartment, she hummed softly as she walked up the stairs and checked her phone. It seemed Kamui Woods was getting more popular since his debut, and she smiled in excitement. One day she would debut. She wondered what her hero name would be. When she was younger, she had so many different variations of All Might's name it made her cheeks heat just thinking about it, and she pushed her bangs back. Obviously, she couldn't have a name like Mighty Girl or something similar. Getting to her floor, she opened the stairway door and glanced out and smiled at the deserted hallway and went to the apartment door. Reaching into her pocket to put her phone away, she frowned when her All Might charm fell off and bent down to grab it, only to freeze when she heard a door open and shut. Mechanically, she stood after grabbing her charm and stuffed it into her pocket, praying to every god she could think of that it wasn't who she thought it was, even as she reached out for the handle. Izumi. Her breath caught and her entire body went rigid. Try and be good, Izumi. It was the same voice. It was the same voice. She had nearly forgotten it. Nearly was able to push away the woman's face entirely. Was almost able to forget her. Slowly she turned her head and saw her. She wore a pink coat over a yellow knee-length dress and some black low-heeled shoes. Her hair braided off to the side. Swallowing past the lump in her throat, she released a slow breath and her hand fell from the doorknob to clench in her shirt instead. Slowly the shocked expression on the woman's face changed into one of anger. What are you doing here? Have you come to haunt me? Is that it? When her mother approached her, she felt a chill crawl up her spine and backed up quickly, tripping over her shoes and just trying to get away. Her breathing was coming quickly and her head felt muddled. She also felt very, very sick to her stomach. And no, I'm sorry, just, please. Hands grabbed her shoulders and shook her and she shut her mouth. You need to leave, do you hear me? I don't want to see you around here again. My family doesn't need the burden of you being here. Tears were blurring her vision and her teeth dug into her bottom lip. Her mother's fingers were digging in so much it hurt, and her breaths were coming faster and faster at the anger in the green eyes that were like her own, and she was shaking. Mom, what are you doing? The young voice made her heart plummet further, and they both looked over to see wide green eyes staring at them from a pale face. The apartment door was wide open and the boy looked like he had just gotten out of the shower. Yudai, go back inside and shut the door. The hands on her shoulders tightened and she winced and cast a frantic around. Let go of her, Mom. You're hurting her. He went to approach when another door opened at the same time her mother spoke. Just go back inside, Yudai. The yell made her ears ring. The boy looked torn and scared and she felt like she was about to vomit when an arm knocked her mother's off of her and then she was scooped up quickly. I don't know what brought this on, the voice thrummed beneath her ear. And she suddenly burst out into tears and buried her face into a familiar white shirt, hands coming up to grip the fabric in a white-knuckled grasp. But I'll have to ask you never to touch my daughter again. This is a warning, and the next time I'll be calling the police. The arms holding her were shaking, and then her world tilted and she flinched as a door slammed shut. There was muffled voices behind it before another door slammed, and she tried to control her breathing. Her chest was squeezing painfully and she couldn't think. Her head was light and her body was shaking and she couldn't focus. Eef. She coughed suddenly, tears choking her, and she couldn't breath. Izumi. A hand was suddenly on her back and she jerked, eyes snapping open, and she found blue searing into her own. Just focus on me. Nothing else matters, all right? Take in a deep breath and count to 3. That's it. I know it's hard. It was like trying to breathe through a coffee straw. And now release slowly for a count of 3, just like that. Good. You're doing great, Izumi. Slowly the pain in her chest eased and her breathing returned to almost normal and she became aware of her surroundings. She was seated on the couch with her dad kneeling in front of her, his concerned eyes staring at her, and she snuffled softly and slowly unclenched her hands from where they still had a hold of his shirt and she felt wrung out. Exhaustion made her shoulders droop and she leaned forward, pressing her forehead into his shoulder and closing her eyes when arms wrapped around her. You're okay now. I've got you. A hand rubbed up and down her back slowly and she released a shuddering breath, and the silence was only broken by their breathing, and she moved her head to press her ear against his chest and listened to the heart beating beneath it. Just sleep, Izumi. I'll still be here when you wake up. She let out a slow hum before letting her eyes close, and within moments she knew no more. It was hard not to show anything, but he knew if he did then it would only upset the girl further, and so choked it back, grit his teeth and put her before his feelings. But damn if he wasn't pissed off. What right did that woman have to do that? To talk to Izumi like that? To lay her hands on his daughter? He had to use every bit of self-control not to channel one for all when he had knocked that woman back. Otherwise she might have been flung the length of the hallway. But she was a civilian, he was a hero. Punching someone just because they pissed him off was not something people would smile upon. Right, okay, deep breath in and out. Coughing and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he gently laid Izumi on the couch and reached out, dragging the blanket there down and tucking it around her before standing. He had suggested it before, but now it was firmly in his head. He wouldn't allow something like this to happen again. And besides, it wasn't like he didn't have the money to afford a house. Moving. The word was breathed out in surprise as she stared into serious blue eyes. The weight in the gaze made her uncomfortable and her hands clenched together. She had slept clear until morning and she was ashamed to have missed school entirely. waking when it was near 12 in the afternoon and tucked into her bed. Her All Might comforter wrapped around her and a rabbit plush she knew she didn't own tucked in with her. Considering her dad's tucking in skills were more wrapped child until they resemble a burrito, she knew who had done it. She had hugged the rabbit plush close anyway. It was amazingly soft and bright yellow, and she wasn't fooled at all. All it would need was a little cape and it would resemble All Might in rabbit form. It was sweet, and it took her mind off of what had happened yesterday, until he sat her down at their coffee table and told her he wanted her help looking at houses because they would be moving. Yes, I figured since you'll be living there as well, it's only right to pick one you would like as well. We'd even be able to get our own furniture. As the things here came with the house, she looked around at the furniture. It was well worn but nice. She had assumed he had bought it, but now it was explained it made a little sense. But won't it inconvenience you to have to do all that? It was just a small argument. And if I'm careful next time I can avoid her. She didn't look at him, so she jumped when a hand gently took hers and pulled her hands from each other to cover them. You shouldn't have to, Izumi. And to be honest, if something like this did happen again, I don't think I'd be able to hold in my temper. I was really angry at that woman. His head tilted down until the shadows on his face seemed to deepen further. I don't understand her. Yes, you don't have a quirk, but why should that matter? You have more kindness and love in your heart than the majority of Japan combined. You look at people and see more than anyone. You're so smart it makes my head hurt just thinking about it, and you've made me so proud with how strong you've been. To see you have come this far without letting bitterness or anger take you over, a normal person would have broken long ago under pain like that. Izumi swallowed past the lump in her throat and felt her hands shaking. You want to become a hero. I was skeptical when I first found out you didn't have a quirk. The people I've fought, not having a quirk would make it impossible to defeat them. He went quiet and the silence stretched out while her heart pounded. But I think you can do it. You can become a hero, and you'll be the stuff of legends. His was smiling then. It was so bright that her breath caught and tears began pouring from her eyes. That's why I've decided to pass on my power to you. You will carry the torch into the new generation. Her mind blanked in confusion at those words. Why, you're going to train me? The words were squeaked out and he leaned back slightly and thought. Yes, additional training would be good, and I suppose waiting a bit longer would make the transition more comfortable, perhaps around your 15th birthday. It's a thought. His finger was on his chin and thought, and her mind was skipping like a scratched-up CD. Transition. Dad, I don't understand, she asked, and blue eyes looked at her before something lit them up. I suppose I better explain. My quirk is called One for All and isn't genetic. Instead, it is passed down from mentor to student by will alone. She felt dizzy suddenly. Her head was altogether to light, and she felt like if this was an anime, her eyes would be swirling. A hand patted her shoulder, and she blinked hard to stare at the bemused expression on the blonde's face. Remember when I said I was a late bloomer? In reality, I was like you and was born quirkless. My mentor, who was the 7th holder of the quirk known as One for All, passed it on to me, and when you are 15, I will pass it to you. A quirk that could be passed on by choice, regardless of if the person was the other's blood relation or not. She would be like All Might, a dream that had been hers since she was young. But if you give it up, what happens to you? She asked, concerned, and he hummed. I can only hold my powered-up form for 4 hours, if you recall. When I give you One for All, I'll still be able to do hero work, but by then my time will begin to decrease. Hopefully by that time you'll have graduated, and I'll be able to have you as my sidekick in public for a while. And then step down, as it were, with you taking my place. The sudden pressure of the thought made her faintly nauseous, and she took in a deep, even breath and gripped her knees. Don't think of it too hard, Izumi. You can still refuse if you wish, as it's a big responsibility, and to be honest, I was hesitant to make this suggestion. Not through any fault of your own, but I know with my power you will have to face a lot of danger. He shrugged and leaned back in his seat. But without it you'll be in more danger, and in a way I'll be there to protect you, even if it's just through the fact it was passed down from me to you. Her mind was racing. A quirk that could be passed down through sheer will alone. She had never heard of something like that. But then again, perhaps that was a good thing. If someone knew about it, they would covet it, and would do anything to have it. All her life she had contemplated what All Might's quirk could be, as had most of the world. But to know it was one that was passed down from mentor to student was mind-boggling. What kind of quirk was it really then? Obviously it increased strength and endurance, but then in that sense, why hadn't she heard of anyone having a strength quirk as strong as All Might's? Unless it was a stockpiling. One for All stockpiles power, doesn't it? That's why I've never heard of anyone as strong as you before. Because each user of One for All is stronger than the last. She looked up and flushed red at the amused and fond look that was aimed at her. Got it in one, my girl. One for All indeed stockpiles the strength from each user and passes it down to the next. He held out a hand palm up, and she stared as the skin there seemed to glow briefly before he clenched it into a fist. It also in a way carries the spirits of the past users. Their will is infused into it. He smiled softly then. With or without my power, though, you will be a wonderful hero. In the end, it's your choice, though. I'll have to ask you not to share the truth of the quirk with anyone. She nodded faintly as her mind went over everything that had been told to her. Looking up at him, she fiddled with her fingers. When I'm 15, if you still feel I'm worthy enough to inherit one for all, then yes, I'll do it. Her heart was racing and she returned his smile and squeezed her eyes shut when he reached out and messed up her hair. I doubt I'll find anyone more worthy, Izumi. She found her smile brightening as she thought of that fact, to be as strong as All Might. Picturing it in her head, she blanched slightly. Dad, will I look like you when you power up? The sudden image of one of those ladies who bodybuild flashed through her mind, and she swallowed thickly and startled when her dad suddenly busted out into full-blown laughter, one hand coming up to cover his face while the other clutched at his side. Dad. He was still laughing, a wheezing-like noise escaping him, and she swallowed thickly. Dad, come on, it's not that funny, Dad. His face was turning red for an entirely different reason than her own, and she pouted. Dad. It was only later that she realized she still hadn't given him the shirt she had bought him. The pattern was like All Might's current costume, with 2 yellow rabbit-like ears hanging from the back and across the front. Mighty Dad was in bright red outlined in white. Her own was just like it, but had Mighty Daughter on the front. Giving it to him was embarrassing, but the look on his face was worth it, and the hug even more so. The fact he actually wore it when they went out made her both pleased and slightly hysterical. Her dad was wearing his own merchandise, and for some reason it was funny to her. But at least now people didn't look at her dad like he was doing something bad when they were in public together, so that was another plus. Bonus. No, Dad, we don't need a house with a security fence. Why would you think that? No reason. I've just been getting this odd feeling I'll need to keep certain hormonal pests out. Confusion entered green eyes. Pests? Yes, blonde ones. Is that the last of it? The voice was a soft groan and blue eyes glanced over. Oh, come on. You and I both know that this is barely a workout for you. A snort was the blonde's only answer, and the thin man huffed. I don't even know why you're complaining. It's not like we own a lot anyway, just some personal items. The furniture in this place is new. A hand reached into the box and pulled out a familiar comforter with the blonde man's hero persona all over it and a red eyebrow rose. Narcissism isn't a good look for you. String Bean, reaching over the blonde, snatched the item back and stuffed it back into the box. That's Izumi's, you asshole. Don't go digging through my daughter's stuff. Folding the flaps back, blue eyes peered back to the entrance of the house. Speaking of her, will she be okay with her kids? He was unsure. Every time a child her own age learned she was quirkless, there were problems, and he knew all about them because he had gone through the same thing. Cut the cord, Toshinori. She'll be fine without you lurking over her shoulder like the scarecrow you are. The redhead picked up a box holding the pots and pans he owned and stepped around a kotatsu in the living area to enter into the kitchen. Thin lips pulled down in a slight frown. I'm not a scarecrow, he grumbled and hefted a duffel bag higher on his shoulder and shuffled towards the hallway. The house they had decided on was a single-story 2-bedroom, with a full bathroom that had a tub large enough for him to actually relax in without having his knees up to his ears. And it was also still close enough for Izumi to get to school, granted though she would have to take a bus there instead of walking. But when she got into UA she would be able to walk again. You look like a scarecrow like that. Did you run out of time doing stupid shit again? The gruff voice drew the blonde's attention and blue eyes narrowed slightly in annoyance. I'll have you know I still have a half hour left. I'm just saving it for emergencies, he called back and opened a door, letting the bag drop from his shoulder with a slight groan. Like scaring off boys from your puddle of sunshine. And Daisy's blue eyes glances up beseechingly at the ceiling, as if it would help his patience hold. That was once, and you act like I'm one of those overprotective fathers that carry a shotgun in their back pocket. Toshinori moved back to the entrance and picked up one of the smaller boxes. The poor boy was asking her for directions, and you appear behind him and loom. He nearly pissed himself, you know. Your eyes glow when you're angry, and from a skeleton like you it's not the most pleasant sight. Walking over to the bookshelf, the blonde pulled open the box and began placing the various pieces of literature into it. Okay, 1. He wasn't asking for directions. And 2, his eyes weren't even looking at her face the whole time he was talking to her. The blonde held up his hands beside his head, 2 fingers on each, making quotation motions beside his head, and his face deadpanned the entire time. And you can't tell me you didn't act like this with Fayumi. The only difference between you and I is I don't light myself on fire like the devil himself. And laughed. Then the kids pass out. The redhead shrugged. But it's effective, he pointed out in the blonde test. You're just jealous you can't puff up without giving yourself away. Blue eyes narrowed and focused on the books in his hands as opposed to the redhead moving around the house. Hey, whatever happened to that blonde kid? The one your girl took the belt off of? Immediately the blonde was suddenly puffed up and blue eyes were trying to light the book in his hands on fire. No, he simply intoned, and the redhead laughed. He wondered if he could get away with punching the other man into the sun. He'd survive, right? Are you sure this is okay? The question was posed to a boy her age with red and white hair split evenly down the middle with one turquoise eye and one gray. They stood a few feet from each other with her in a loose defensive stance and him mirroring her. A little ways away was his other siblings, a girl with white hair with red highlights and gray eyes, and two boys around a year apart, one with white hair and the other red. Both had turquoise eyes. It'll be fine. I won't use my quirk, so it'll be a fair spar. She swallowed thickly past the irritation that bubbled in her, pushing it away with the logic that quirk use in public was frowned upon. But still, the comment made her mind switch from not wanting to hurt him to, well, she'd show him fair all right. Green eyes narrowing, her head tilted to the side slightly and her hands lowered just a half-inch. All right then. Ready when you are, Shadow-sen. There were too many Todorokis in the area to use the last name, so she had to just go with first names or get her and everyone else hopelessly confused. All right. First person to be restrained or give up loses. Fight. The redhead yelled. She remembers his name being Renji. Shadow ran at her and she remembered his words again. He only viewed it as fair if he didn't use his quirk. The thought made something inside her burn. When he was close enough, she didn't hesitate. Twisting to the side to avoid his thrown hit, she grabbed him around the shoulder and arm, used her other leg to kick both his out from underneath him, and with a yell, threw him over her shoulder and onto his back with perhaps more force than necessary. But dang, had it felt good. Two-toned eyes were staring up at the sky beneath her. The blatant shock in them was amusing. Still, she had a match to win, so made sure to keep her knee on his chest and her hand hovering over his neck. Ooh, Yagi-san wins. The Renji stuttered after a moment, and she stood and held a hand out, and after a second he reached up and grabbed it, looking even more shocked when she easily pulled him to his feet. I feel like I should apologize, he said finally, and she tilted her head as the other three siblings made their way over. It's fine, I've gotten used to it. Can't say it doesn't help when people underestimate me. It actually had helped a lot in her judo matches. Apparently, even if you couldn't use quirks during judo, people still thought you were weak if you simply didn't have one. Man, I don't think I've seen Shu-chan hit the ground that fast in my life. How strong are you? The boy with the white hair was Shiro, if she remembered correctly. Thinking on the question, she thought back to pushing old refrigerators across a decrepit beach and wondered how they would think of her when she revealed she could carry her dad in all might form on her shoulders. However short of a time she was able to do it. But then again, that wasn't really something she could tell them anyway, so I can lift a fridge. I haven't really thought about it too much. She cupped her chin and thought. Whoa, hey, you think you could bench press someone? Renji mimed holding something heavy and lifting it up and down, and she raised an eyebrow. I've never tried. She watched Shiro cover his face suddenly and had a sinking feeling when Renji pushed Fuyumi forward. Here, try it with Fuyumi-san. His smile was bright and she stared in shock as the older girl blanched. Renji, you don't just tell someone to do something. And who gave you permission to volunteer me for something like this? Izumi flushed as Shadow-sen sighed in exasperation while the white-haired girl kept berating her brother. You could always have her lift you if you're so eager, Shiro's suggestion, and Izumi stared at him before looking over to the red-haired boy. He was around 6'0" and probably weighed close to 220 pounds. He was built much like his father, actually, and still growing as he was only 17. But her dad was 7'1" and 562 pounds in his hero form. I could do that, which is how she ended up standing over Renji. He had his arms crossed tightly and his ankles locked together while the other three Todoroki siblings stood off to the side. Shiro had a camera out and she tried not to focus on it too much. Right, I'll have to grab you by the torso and thighs, so here it goes. She reached down and made sure to get a good grip. Just don't hurt yourself, princess. Green brow raising at the address, she made sure she had a good hold on the older boy before testing her grip. Taking a deep breath, and she pulled and lifted, arms not even straining all that much as she heard a yelp above her head and she glanced up at wide pale eyes. Okay. Put me down now, please. She stared up at him in disbelief. But weren't you eager to see if she could do this? Looks to me Yagi-san isn't even breaking a sweat, Shadow-sen called, mouth tilted up in a smirk as Fuyumi giggled and Shiro was snapping multiple pictures. Izumi, everything is unpaw. What are you doing? Green eyes went a little wide. She looked over her shoulder at her dad and smiled brightly. Hey dad, she called cheerily and wondered at the look on her dad's and Todoroki-san's faces. She was just proving a point, Yagi-san. Fuyumi called with an easy smile as Izumi let her arms drop and carefully set the older boy down. He staggered dramatically to the side before collapsing and hugging the ground, and she felt her smile twist in confusion. What do you feed her, beanpole? The words were barely audible from the flame hero and the blonde snorted. Wouldn't you like to know? Blue eyes locked with turquoise and the red-headed boy blanched even as Izumi remained oblivious. Oh, for fuck's sake, Toshinori. I remember how you were in high school, Inji. Hot-blooded would be putting it mildly. That was years ago. How do you still remember that? You'd be surprised on what I seem to recall. Hot lips. A sputtering noise came from the red-haired man and he gaped. Satisfied at his victory, Toshinori turned back to his daughter and ushered her into the house and away from the boys. Bonus. Dad. Green eyes took in her room. It was decorated like she usually had it, decked out in hero merch top to bottom with All Might taking up most of it. Yes, Izumi. Green eyes took in her bed in confusion. Why are there so many bunny plushies on my bed? It was like the stuffed toys had found out a way to multiply like their living counterparts. I thought you might like them. They're cute, right? The blonde smiled and she just stared at it in confusion. They were very, very cute, but you know what? I have a feeling I don't want to know, she finally sighed before flopping face first into her bed. Wait, what? The words were soft as she stared at her dad in horror before green eyes trailed down to stare at the shining golden strand he held. To gain one for all you need to ingest my DNA, he said, and pushed his hand forward and she leaned back. This was not what she envisioned getting her father's quirk to be like. Shining light, some weird ritual. But no, apparently it was eating a hair. Oh come on, if you can eat uni you can eat one single hair, Izumi. Exasperation coated her dad's words and she shot a weak glare up at him as he waved the strand underneath her nose. That was because I lost a bet, not because I like it. She grabbed the hair in one hand and her chopsticks in the other and picked up a piece of chutoro, grumbling as she wrapped the hair around it while shooting her dad looks over her sashimi bowl. Quickly she shoved the hair-laced sashimi down her throat as fast as possible while trying not to think about it and shuddered, reaching out to grab her jasmine tea to chase it down. Now I know why you got me this. Why does it have to be a hair? She grumbled and her dad leaned his elbow on their kotatsu, chin in his hand as both his blonde brows rose. I could have always sneezed on your food if you'd like. Her stomach lurched and she slammed her face into the table. Dad. A laugh was her only answer and she let out a soft whine as her forehead ached from meeting the table. Relax, I wouldn't have really done that. Besides, I had to do the same thing. You honestly think it was pleasant for me? She grumbled and shoveled a piece of salmon into her mouth and chewed angrily, green eyes staring balefully at him, and he snorted and pointedly took a sip of his smoothie. Finally she sighed and leaned up and tilted her head. I don't feel any different, she said and flexed her hand with furrowed brows. I must have not done it right. I think you'll need to eat another. Then her eyes went wide before her dad's laugh caught her attention and she grit her teeth when a hand messed up her hair. Ha ha, Dad, very funny. She was dragged into his side in a hug and relaxed against him. It'll take a bit to cycle through your system. I think in a few hours you'll be good to go. Just remember what I told you about controlling your strength. Too much and you'll break something. She nodded and tried to suppress her shiver. The thought of an arm full of shattered bones did not sound fun. I have plenty of time to teach you though. It's still a month until entrance exams, so until then we'll be trying to get you used to it. She hummed softly and picked up a piece of otoro this time and dabbed it in a bit of wasabi and soy sauce before chasing it with some rice. Was it hard for you when you first got one for all? She asked and he hummed softly. No, physically I was able to handle it easily. She pouted and tilted her head back to stare up at him with a blank expression. You do realize how unfair that is, right? I have to worry about breaking something. You could just puff up and prance off. She waved her chopsticks and her dad snorted. I did not just prance off, thank you. I don't prance, she hummed unconvinced and was shoved lightly before they both settled comfortably against each other until a shrill ring from the blonde's phone caught his attention and he reached out. They're having some trouble. She pushed herself to sit up and watched her dad stand and stretch, catching a slight grimace twist his features before he shot her a smile and shuffled into his room to change into his hero costume. Biting her lip, Izumi quickly finished her sashimi bowl and downed her tea. Taking her dad's leftover smoothie and putting a lid on it before popping it into the fridge, she quickly pulled her hair up and took off the tie around her wrist to wrap it and fiddled grabbed her notebook before standing beside the back door. When her dad came out swamped in his hero costume, she perked up and he smiled crookedly. Want to take notes on this one too? He asked, and she craned her head back when his form changed and All Might was standing there instead. Holding up her notebook, she smiled brightly. Can't be too prepared. She reached out and opened the door and they both stepped out into their fenced-in backyard, and she shut the door while her dad stretched his arms. Stepping over to him, she was lifted and pulled her hoodie down over her face and pulled up her face mask to cover the lower half of her face. She didn't have to do this before, but that was also before her dad decided to run and help someone while wearing his mighty dad shirt. With her tucked into his arm, and only through the grace of good fortune had she been wearing a hoodie to obscure her face then. Now the world knew All Might had a kid, but not gender, age, or name of said kid. Gripping the man's shoulder, she ducked her head and braced herself before they were airborne, and she gulped and wondered if someday she'd be able to jump this high. It didn't take long to get to the location, and her dad landed on a rooftop and dropped her off. With a rough pat on her back, he was jumping down, and she pulled her pen out and flipped her notebook open as her eyes locked on the villain. Gender, female, height looks around 5'7" to 5'10", dark skin and short pale hair, seems to be able to control dirt. No rocks in the dirt. She watched as the female took one look at her dad and started pulling large boulders from the ground and completely wrecking the street, and Izumi's lips pulled down. Complete disregard for damages caused or human lives put at risk. Typical low-level villain behavior, can't seem to keep calm. Trips over her feet. She's new, possibly just started trying her luck recently, could easily be subdued with strength, speed, or ice. As she watched her dad punch the boulders into dust, and she rolled her eyes and made a side note. He really needs to learn restraint. Looking at the damage, she hummed. They'll need to call Cementos in to fix the streets again. And some of the buildings. She blinked hard when she watched how fast the woman was. She was practically slipping around her dad as he tried to grab her, and Izumi's eyebrows furrowed. But why would such a low-level villain make such a big commotion? It's not intelligent. It could be explained away as inexperience or a distraction. Yes, green eyes widened and she whipped around and came face to face with a man taller than her with pale bluish-white hair and hands all over him. So, you're All Might's kid. I have to say I and Sensei were surprised he had any family. Makes it all the better, I suppose. When his hand reached out, she scrambled back. Based on his actions, his quirk was touch-based. She couldn't let him grab a hold of her. Fast, aren't you? She stumbled when the rooftop shook and his hand gripped her hoodie, and green eyes blew wide when it crumbled beneath his touch and her hands flashed out, one grabbing around his wrist and twisting it so his arm was straight while the other hit into a part just above his elbow, and he let out a yell while she leapt back away from his other grasping hand. Her hoodie was disintegrated from the stomach outward and her pale yellow tank top was visible. That hurt. You used a pressure point on my arm to numb it, didn't you? Interesting. She looked up and swallowed thickly and crouched into a ready stance as more noise came from below them. It sounded like something big was happening, but she didn't dare look away from this weird man. What do you want? Her voice was weak to her own ears, and the man laughed and tilted his head, and she could suddenly see his eyes and felt her blood run cold at the look in them and felt her muscles freeze. She couldn't move, could barely breath. What do I want? Ha ha, he straightened, and even with the hand on his face she could tell his was smiling, and his low chuckle made her heart pound frantically in her chest. I want All Might dead, but now that I know that you exist, I'd like him to be broken before I do it. White noise threaded into her ears as she processed his words. He wanted All Might dead. Just the thought made her stomach roll unpleasantly and acid burned the back of her throat. I wonder what his expression would be when he finds you dead and broken. Will he still have that idiotic smile on his face? Green eyes slowly looked up into red and he was closer, but her body wouldn't move. I don't think he will. A hand reached up, but suddenly everything was dark in her eyes and she looked over slowly and breathed out harshly. 7 pairs of eyes glowed in the darkness that looked back, and she felt something surging in her body before glancing down at the warmth along her arm. It was a shadowy pale hand that curled around her own. Everything went into sharp focus then, and she used one hand to deflect the reaching hand and then with a yell drove her fist into his stomach. There was a moment of stillness before the man flew backwards and pain lanced up her arm and she clutched it, teeth gritting as she fell to a knee. Her entire body was shaking from fear and pain, and when she looked up the man was clutching his stomach and vomiting on the other side of the roof, and she stiffened when black mist suddenly curled around the pale-haired figure. Feet landed beside her then, and she realized she recognized the voice that was speaking to her, but could only stare at the mist as it swallowed the man up and vanished. Large hands picked her up and she was wrapped in a familiar cape. The pain from her arm had dulled and she was able to see red irritated skin and the bones ached, but darkness was already encroaching in her vision. As she lost consciousness, all she could see were glowing eyes watching her from that darkness. She froze. Not the best prospect to turn your attention to. So defensive. You've always had a soft heart. We'll see. A vibration jolted the blonde up with a soft snort. Blue eyes blinked hard before another vibration made him fumble for his pocket and extract his phone, and eyebrows rose in disbelief at the number that showed. Clicking answer, he held the phone up to his ear and stood, leaving the room with a worried glance to the figure laying on the bed. I wasn't expecting a call from you. His feet took him to his living room and he winced slightly. Ah yes, you saw that then. I was going to tell you. Eventually, lowering himself into an armchair he had taken a shine to at the furniture, he took a second to appreciate it before the voice on the other end made him focus. She's not biologically mine though, Satoshi. There was a long pause before the blonde's mouth firmed. I know. I didn't mean for it to happen, and it was an oversight on my part. I leapt ahead without thinking again, and I know that. And he would never forgive himself for acting without thinking. He had been called bullheaded and oafish often enough, but now it had put his daughter in danger. Blue eyes darkened and his hand tightened on the phone. The voice on the other end was softer this time, and Toshinori took in a deep breath before releasing it. If you'd like you can. I've moved though, so my address has changed. He quickly recited it, and afterwards the call ended. Lowering the phone, he bowed his head and ran a hand through his hair and tried to calm his thought. Just the thought of what had happened, of seeing Izumi so frightened and hurt. She had been so close to being hurt. Or worse, and he hadn't been there. She had been in danger because of him. Closing his eyes, he rested his elbows on his knees and tried to control his breathing. He could understand now why his mentor had given up her own child, and for a second he considered it before pushing the thought away. She was already a target, and she had one for all. But most of all, he couldn't stand the thought of abandoning her like that woman had done. It would surely break the girl, and he didn't think he would ever recover from it as well. For now, all he could do was hope he was strong enough to protect her until she could protect herself. Pushing himself to his feet, he ran a hand down his face and coughed hard to clear the blood from his throat. wiping at it absent-mindedly with a cloth and moving back to Izumi's room. He had begged recovery girl to come over and see to her and had gotten scolded, but the older woman had still taken a look at his daughter and then healed her. Her entire arm from the hand to the upper arm was broken in several places, and it made his heart ache that she had been in that much pain. His face must have shown his remorse and worry because the woman only berated him lightly before patting his knee and seeing herself out. He had made sure she was tucked in and comfortable after the healing and had been in there with her since. Settling back into her desk chair, he was glad she had gotten one that was large for her to curl up in. It was almost just large enough for his tall form. He had to teach her so much and there was so little time. If villains were already after her only just after she had been revealed, he could only be glad they hadn't seen her face. More than ever, he had to keep his hero life and his civilian life separate, for her sake at least. The days following the incident were full of food, full of protein and vitamins pushed down her throat and being pushed hard to train and refine her newly acquired quirk. But today he couldn't. That's when today he called in someone she lovingly referred to as the devil himself. Normally she wouldn't be so crass with one of her dad's friends, but Todoroki-san thought it was fine to train her to dodge, and while she would agree normally, having him scream dodge at her while lobbing fireballs the size of Buicks at her was something she was not fond of. Being distracted in the middle of a fight will get you killed, brat. Heat made her hastily pushing herself over in a roll and flames roared past her. Why her dad thought this was a grand ideal she'd no clue, and she wished he was here if only to toss him into the path of Todoroki-san's fire. Instead he was meeting with someone. Before she herself was introduced to them, apparently an old friend. Flames suddenly filled her vision and she paled. Shit, she hissed before her hand curled into a fist and she grit her teeth and concentrated. With a yell she punched forward and up, and the flames guttered and missed her and she bit her lip when her arm throbbed, but it wasn't broken. Yet, by the diabolical look on Todoroki-san's face, he wouldn't be satisfied until she was on the floor or dead. There was a high possibility he was actually trying to kill her, but he wouldn't. Right. He was a hero. You know what? She wasn't going to risk it. That was pretty good. Now do it again. Without sniveling, flames roared higher along his shoulders and arms, and she whimpered internally. Externally she was growling to herself and jumping away from flames. She was drenched in sweat and her clothes were singed, and she just wanted this to end. Her temper was climbing the higher this went on, and frustration was skittering up and down her spine. She took deeper breaths to try and calm herself and settle her anger because she needed to think not. Is that all you can do, little girl? Run away. Toshinori must not be doing a very good job at teaching you. Unsurprising, really. Oh no. He did not just go there. Her dad was amazing, thank you very much. The only person who could badmouth him was her. It seemed the fire had invaded her veins as she stopped and slowly turned her head to lock eyes with his turquoise, and her head tilted slightly to the right. He wanted her to come after him. Fine, she'd do just that. Warmth lanced down her back and up along her cheeks before she shifted and crouched underneath his flames and pushed off with her feet, finding herself flying towards him. Izumi, Inji, what the hell? The word snapped her out of her anger better than any bucket of ice water, and she blanched when fire was almost right on top of her before large arms wrapped around her, and she grew dizzy before the world righted itself, and she blinked hard and pushed sweaty bangs from her forehead. What the hell do you think you're doing, Inji? I said give her a few pointers. That doesn't translate to roasting her like a Thanksgiving turkey. The voice was booming and she covered her ears as her eyes swirled. Calm down. I had everything under control. Arms tightened around her and she was shifted so she sat on one like it was a chair while a hand warmed her back. Are you hurt, Izumi? If I'd known he'd do this, I wouldn't have left you alone with him. The hand patted her back and she let out a slow breath. Honestly, her entire body ached and was soaked from sweat. There wasn't a dry piece of fabric on her. But she found herself smiling slightly anyway at such a panicky tone of voice coming from someone who usually spoke so flamboyantly. I'm fine, Dad. Her lips quirked. You're here now after all? Blue eyes widened at her before he snorted and a loud smack sounded out through the room as Todoroki-san's hand met his forehead and a pain-sounding groan escaped him. Good. The bastard deserved some sort of pain after what she went through. So this is her, then? The voice drew her eyes to golden ones and she realized he was tall, but sitting as she was they were almost eye level. He had green hair pulled back with yellow highlights in it and wore a business suit. Her eyes widened slightly when she finally placed where she knew him from. Yes, this is my daughter, Izumi. Izumi, this is. Without realizing it, she cut her dad off, her excitement getting the best of her. Sir Night-Eye. He used to be your psychic, but almost 6 years ago you both split up and he went on to become a professional pro hero with his own office. She really wished she had her newest hero analysis journal on her. Maybe he would sign it. The man's eyes regarded her and she felt her enthusiasm die slightly. Well, you have energy for sure. She bit her lip and felt her mood plummet. Did he not like her? Oh, see, Monday to Saturday, Oshi. Lighten up. Her dad reached out and patted the other on the shoulder and a yellow brow rose and she was lowered to her feet. Now, Inji, I thank you and I need to have it. At his cut-off words, she looked up and followed her dad's gaze to his arm and the soft smudge of blood there, and she stared at it confused. Blood? Why didn't you tell me you were hurt, Izumi? Her dad's hands covered her shoulders and she was tilted this way and that, and she found her eyebrows furrowed. She hadn't been cut or anything, and from where the blood was, it was where she was sitting. Her thoughts screeched to a halt in horror as a familiar cramp-like sensation made itself known, and she let out a mortified whimper. Izumi, where are you hurt? Do I need to get you to a hospital? Her dad had began to shake her gently, and oh God, kill her, kill her, now, right now. NG was over now, and her dad had taken to shaking him and demanding what he had done to her, and Sir Night-Eye was saying something about an ambulance and pulling out his phone, and her breathing was getting fast. Green eyes looking everywhere, but when her dad began pulling at her clothes demanding to see an injury, she found herself moving, hand flashing out to smack his away and bolting only to run into someone. She looked up at the concerned-looking white-haired woman and sniffled before shoving her face into the woman's stomach and cried. Oh dear, the woman sighed, and Izumi sniffled when arms wrapped around her shoulders. What's wrong, sweetie? Face red, the green-haired girl looked up and then shifted a bit. Words failed her, so she only gestured to her stomach, and gray eyes widened in understanding before she huffed. You can all calm down, I'll handle it. She looked up with a look towards the three men standing awkwardly behind them. Honestly, men, come with me, Izu-chan. There should still be some of Fuyu-chan's clothes from when she was your age. The embarrassed girl followed after the white-haired woman and couldn't bring herself to glance back. What just happened? Toshinori got out because his daughter was bleeding, and Shiori just tells them to calm down. She was bleeding, she was hurt. A sigh from his left and a groan from his right came from Satoshi and Enji, respectively. At what age did you say you adopted Izumi-san? His former sidekick's voice was dry as he replaced his phone into his back pocket. I didn't say, but she was around 12, he finally answered, and Enji walked over to a sink that had somehow survived the carnage that was the training room. And she's turning 15 soon. How could you live with her this long and not know this? The redhead growled and wet a washcloth before throwing it at him, and the blonde barely managed to catch it. Know what? He wiped the blood from his arm, and the man beside him shifted, and when he looked over, golden eyes weren't looking at him. The man's face was pinched and he was rubbing his forehead. You really are an idiot, aren't you? Didn't your teachers ever tell you about the bird and the bees? You're 40 years old, man. Think about it. Why would your teenage daughter be bleeding without a wound and then freak out and run? Blue eyes stared at the other man blankly before the words seeped in. There it is. Yes, it is what you think it is. How you didn't notice for 3 damn years, I'll never know. Whenever Fayumi got hers, it was like a war zone. She might have gotten her mother's ice, but she got my temper. The man looked proud of that, but currently Toshinori could only think on the fact his daughter was. Oh dear. And of course he was a complete fucking idiot about it and only made her feel worse, and he was a horrible father. To be fair, she might have only had mild cramps each month. All women are different when it comes to things like that. Satoshi's voice drew his attention back to the present. So they say. All I know is during these days it's best to just duck and cover and occasionally throw Midol and chocolate their way until they aren't possessed anymore. Chocolate and painkillers. Recognition filled him. That's why the cashier said that. Silence greeted his exclamation, and he looked up at a deadpan stare and a faintly exasperated one. God help that girl, she's gonna need it. Taking in a deep breath, she let it out slowly, and her grip tightened on the straps of her backpack. She could do this. All the training her dad helped her with, all her training from Hana-san. She would not let it go to waste. You'll do fine, and I'll be here to pick you up afterwards. A hand was warm on her shoulder, and she nodded before looking over and smiling sheepishly at her dad. Good luck, hug, she asked weakly, and the blonde laughed and immediately pulled her closer and wrapped her own arms around him and enjoyed the warmth from his embrace. Not that you'll need the luck, but I can never say no to hugs. His arms squeezed her a second more before they pulled back, and he ruffled her hair, and at that point of time she had just stopped trying to get people to do that and accepted her fate. Now get going or else you'll be late. He nodded towards the car door, and she sucked in a bracing breath before pushing the door open and stepping out, closing it behind her. Looking up at the tall building that was to be the entrance exam building, she gulped. Izumi. She looked back, and her dad shot her a thumbs up in a wide smile. Smile more genuine now. She returned the gesture and stepped back to watch him drive off. Turning back to the building, she squeezed her eyes shut briefly before they shot open. She would do this. She would get into UA. There was no other option for her if she was to take up her dad's mantle. The written exam was laughably easy for her. She had studied for the past month along with her physical training and had even gotten her dad's help as he had gone to UA once as well. But standing there in the room and being told their opponents were robots, giant robots, it was a tad terrifying and slightly unfair, she thought, to people who didn't have a flashy quirk. Wasn't there more to being a hero than just taking down villains? What about the people you were supposed to take care of? There were so many heroes she knew of that didn't have flashy quirks and yet were amazing heroes, like Eraserhead, who was an underground hero. Sir Night-Eye's quirk was foresight, and he could only use it once every 24 hours. Didn't help him against the supersized robot. Mandalay from the Pussycats. Ms. Joke. Countless others without quirks that wouldn't fare well against foes like this. A school as prestigious as UA wouldn't make such an oversight, so why? unless the scoring system wasn't based just on the points collected from destroying the enemy. Instead, there must be a hidden point system they don't talk about, something that would be overlooked by young hopefuls that have been pointed at something and told just hit this and you'll pass. A nudge to her side jolted her from her quiet thoughts until she realized they hadn't been that quiet. A boy beside her had nudged her and his purple eyes were looking at her. He had hair that was messy and seems to want to spit on the concept of gravity because it stuck straight up. And he also had deep bags underneath his eyes, and honestly, he looked a tad creepy, and that he needed about a full day's worth of sleep. You think it's true? He finally asked, and she blinked hard as her brain tried to reboot. He snorted at her look and jerked his head to the projection and present Mike, who was still giving a few more pointers. About the point system, you don't think it's complete combat-based? He asked, and after a second she nodded and matched his hushed tone. Think about it. At hero school, that's entrance exam only has you destroying things. The first thing when we think of heroes isn't how high their score is when it comes to villains. We think about how they save people, or at least I do. She rubbed at her neck self-consciously and glanced around but found no one was paying attention to them. With all the chaos going on, there's bound to be kids who trip or injure themselves during the exam. With giant robots walking around willy-nilly, it's impossible not to. So what if there was another scoring system, like rescue points or something? The boy beside her hummed softly and looked to the front where present Mike was gesturing wildly. What's your quirk, anyway? He asked, and she winced. Strength augmentation, but she ducked her head and her hand migrated to rub at the back of her neck now. I can't really control it because I was a late bloomer. It only really came in around a month ago, so when I use it I tend to, break myself. The voice of present Mike was all she heard, and she glanced over to see purple eyes slightly wide looking at her. Break? He asked, and she shrugged and held up a hand. When it first came in, I broke my entire hand. All the bones in my arm all the way to my bicep. She tapped the path up her arm and flexed her hand slightly. My dad was able to call in someone to heal me, and I've been training. But using it at anything less than 5% still causes the broken bones. If it's 5%, then it's only fractures and bruising. She smiled at his blank look. It helps with pain tolerance, at least. You two in the back. The voice made her jolt, and the boy beside her straightened as well. Talking during something like this is disrespectful. Please refrain from it. The guy with blue hair and glasses glared at them, and she gulped and shrank back, and they watched the boy sit as everyone around them laughed. A soft chi came from beside her. He got a stick up his ass or something. Her eyes widened, and her hand came up to cover her mouth to stop her sudden laugh that tried to bubble out, and she slanted a glance towards the boy beside her, who had a faint smile pulling at his mouth. Ignore him. Guys like that have all the luck, I bet. I'm Shinzo Hitoshi. She perked up. Yagi Izumi, she whispered back and smiled brightly at him, and he stared at her a moment before huffing and nodding. Being told the fourth target was a massive robot to run away from, she felt anxiety creep up her spine. A robot that was useless and they shouldn't confront. She moved with the others that were taking the exam and found herself beside Shinzo-san. Still thinking about that rescue theory of yours? He asked, and she nodded. It was more firm in her head now that the fourth enemy had been revealed. It's impossible for everyone here to have a quirk strong enough to take down giant robots. So I'm 89% certain there has to be some helper points or rescue points involved. She goes quiet before hesitantly speaking up next. Would you mind telling me your quirk? She asked, and regretted it when the boy beside her stiffened. Even so, he released a sigh. Brainwashing. I can control anyone who verbally responds to me. He gave her a look then, but her eyes were wide. That's amazing. You could help so many people with that. The boy appeared to almost trip and shot her a surprised look, but she was already talking. Imagine if a villain had a bunch of people hostage. All you would need to do is get him to talk to you and tell him to give up. Or imagine if it was a villain going on a rampage. Insult his legitimacy. And have him wait for police to come and detain him. After his response, they were still walking towards the changing rooms, and her smile was bright as she thought about all the ways he could use his quirk. People who are trying to commit suicide would easily be asked to stop, though you'd probably have to be like Eraserhead, an underground hero, so that people don't know about your quirk until it's too late. She was thinking deeply when a hand tapped her shoulder, and she looked up in confusion, but Shinzo-san's face was more relaxed now, and he had a faint smile. Thanks for that. But you need to go change. He nodded towards the area for the girls, and she blinked before nodding. Yagi-san, thank you for the tips. I'll see you around. His words caused her stomach to fill with butterflies, and her head tilted before she smiled. See you around, Shinzo-san. Good luck. He nodded before waving and turning to go change, and she gripped her bag tighter with a smile and practically skipped towards the girls' changing room. She had what could possibly be her first friend. The feeling from that alone made her heart beat faster and warmth to spread through her body, and she set about changing, pulling off her shoes and socks before focusing on the rest of her clothes. Dang, she jumped and glanced over her shoulder confused and found she was the focus of a girl with pink skin and horns. Her sclera were black and her eyes a deep yellow with wild pink hair. "You're ripped," she finally said, and Izumi flushed and glanced down at herself. She wore her sports bra and some spandex shorts, and her form was muscular, not grotesquely luckily, but her muscles easily showed. Thank you," she asked and grabbed her teal gym clothes she had taken to wearing. "What do you do? Bench press cars for arms like those?" "Mine are like twigs." The pout was audible in the other girl's voice, and Izumi took a moment to think back. It wasn't completely untrue. Was it weird to be as strong as she was? I'm a Shido Mina. You can call me Mina though." Tying the string of her pants around her waist, she offered an unsure smile. "Yagi Izumi. I guess you can call me Izumi." The pink girl smiled brightly, and Izumi focused on pulling on a black tank top before shrugging on her top and zipping it up before sitting on a bench to pull on her red sneakers. "Which field are you in, Izumi-chan?" The green-haired girl flushed at the familiarity the other girl was already using but pushed past it. Maybe it was normal. "Field C," she finally said, and the girl pouted. "Oh, I'm on field A," making sure her laces were tight and then tucked into themselves so she didn't do something stupid like trip on them. She stood, pulled out a hair tie, and wrestled her hair into a rough bun before using a ribbon her dad had given her to secure it. The fact it was All Might themed was also nice. The red, white, blue, and yellow calmed her somewhat. "Would all participants please come to the front of the testing facility?" The words repeated again, but Izumi was already moving, feet going at a light jog to not only keep up with the others towards the field she would be testing in, but also to warm up her muscle. Getting there, she looked around at the group of people and didn't spot Shinso-san or Ashido Mina-san anywhere. Instead, it was just a group of people she didn't recognize at all. A girl had green vines for hair, and there was a very short boy with purple hair that looked like small spheres who was leering at the vine-headed girl, or actually any girl really. Shifting her eyes away, she suddenly heard a booming voice. "Okay, start." Startled, she looked up before glancing over at the other surprised students. "You honestly think in real combat there's a countdown? Run, vamoose, before all the points are taken." Her feet were moving before he had finished his sentence, and she raced into the replica city. It was chaos around her, and she very nearly froze when a robot she remembered was a one-pointer flew around a corner at her. Trying to not give her nerves time to stop her, she channeled one for all into her legs and leapt up and pulled her leg back, slamming her shin into its head, and felt the heat from its explosion. Her leg throbbed gently, but it wasn't fractured or broken, so she kept on, keeping a mental tally on her points but getting distracted when she noticed one of the other kids around her having trouble lifting a slab of concrete to help a boy with white hair, grabbing a girl who almost got hit with flying metal from someone else's attack. When it came to attacking the robots, she always felt a split second of hesitation, but when it came to helping others, she found her body moving before her mind could catch up to it. 3 minutes left. The loud yell was no doubt present mic, and she recounted her points. She had gotten 23 total. Was that enough? What if she was wrong on the rescue points? Looking around, all she could see was destruction, and glanced up to the building around her. She needed to get higher if she hoped to find any more robots, and ran towards a building and up the wall. Reaching out, she grabbed onto the ledge of a window and braced herself before jumping up, grabbing the window ledge just above that one and quickly climbing her way up the building before she crouched on top and looked around, and she bit her lip. There, she saw a three-pointer alone 2 houses down and stood. 2 minutes. Better hurry, listeners. Running along the roof, she sped up when she got to the edge and jumped, rolling to lessen the impact as she hit the other roof and got to her feet already running when a huge crash has her stumbling to a stop, and she looked over and blanched. Not even a block away, a huge monstrosity towered over everything, and her heart gave a weak thud. What the fuck? The words came weakly as she stared up at the giant robot. Wasn't that a bit extreme for an entrance exam? Below her, other exam takers were running, and she changed direction. No way was she going to help. Mind going blank, she turned and saw the creepy purple ball kid from earlier pinned by something she couldn't see from this angle. Damn it all to hell, she groaned, but was already moving. The shadow of the robot fell over her, and her mind was racing as she grabbed a light pole and used it in her momentum to change her angle so she landed right beside the boy and saw it was his leg caught between some concrete. A giant hand was coming at them, and she didn't have time. Teeth gritting, she grabbed it and pulled, and as soon as the boy was loose, she grabbed him by the back of his shirt and pulled her arm back, chucking him away as fast as she could right as the robot's hand was coming towards her, and her head snapped around to stare up at it with narrow eyes that glowed in the dim light. Time's up. And just like that, the robot stopped, hand within feet from smacking into her, and the wind from the sudden full stop blew her hair back, making her stumble on suddenly boneless legs. A shaky breath escaped her, and she pushed herself away from the towering form and found her entire body was shaking from adrenaline and fear, and a good dose of anxiety. Did she do it? Did she have enough points to make it in? More importantly, was the boy okay? Looking over, she saw him blubbering into a girl's chest as said girl was trying to pry him off, and felt her shoulders slump. He was fine then, that was good. She could only hope she hadn't just blown her chances, and the fear was gut-churning. At this rate, baggy eyes were going to be her new permanent facial feature. She hadn't been able to sleep, and despite her dad's reassurances that he was sure that she had gotten in and he was proud of her, she couldn't stop second-guessing herself. How would he know if she had gotten in? Until she had the letter in her own hands and read she was accepted, it just wasn't reality. Her dad had even called in Hana-san to try and calm her, but the strawberry blonde could only put her worries at ease for so long before she had to leave for work. It was nice seeing the woman. And apparently she was engaged, if the ring on her finger was saying anything. The woman was happy and had even invited Izumi and her dad to the wedding. But still, she couldn't think of anything but the fact she might have flunked the second part of the exam. What if she had? Dad would be disappointed for sure. Izumi, you need to eat. Everything will be fine. The warm hand on her shoulder was the last straw, and with a sniff she burst out into tears, and beside her, her dad spat out blood in shock. Izumi, it's okay. Please don't cry. She was pulled into his arms, but she couldn't stop the tears. What if she had failed him by flunking? She hadn't thought of any other school she could go to, hadn't thought that far, and now she wanted to hit herself. Izumi, listen to me. You'll pass all right. You'll be accepted. They would have to be a special brand of idiots not to pass you. The arms around her tightened and she sniffled and rubbed at her face. And even if you don't, which I don't see happening, you can still be a hero anyway. UA isn't the end-all be-all of hero schools. It might be the most popular and produce the most pro-heroes, but it's not the only hero school in the world. Sniffling again, she nodded faintly and a hand ran along her back soothingly. Sorry, she mumbled, and he huffed. It's fine. I should have noticed your stress sooner and confronted you about it. She leaned back and rubbed at her face with her sleeve. Now will you eat something? You're worrying me here. His face twisted in what she guessed was supposed to be a pleading expression, but on him just made his face look weird. And slightly creepy, but mostly weird. Yeah, I guess. She reached out and grabbed her bowl of rice, and beside her the blonde suddenly beamed and picked up his small bowl of food as well. She stared at the little holographic disc after it fizzled out with her results and took in a deep breath. Emotions warred in her, elation over the fact she had passed. She was in the hero course, and then annoyance and a faint hint of betrayal. Dad! A yell tore from her, and she heard something in the living room that resembled something falling and a soft curse in English. Yes, Izumi-chan. Green eyes were narrowed and she pushed herself up. She'd make the blonde pay. Somehow she was going to make him pay for doing that to her. The jerk. Suddenly an ideal made her eyes light up and she smiled deviously. She'd strike when he least expected it. All might. The reporter was hesitant to ask, but even so, when the hero's attention turned to her, the woman's brown eyes went up to his hair. Are you attempting a new fashion statement? The usually bright yellow locks was an alarming shade of neon green, but the hero only laughed loudly. Not at all. It seems my child felt I would look better in green today. At home, Izumi merely smiled.